My grandfather owned a small farm in eastern Kentucky, tucked into a narrow valley about an hour's drive from Hazard, and I spent most of my summers there as a boy in the 1990s. My parents lived in Cincinnati, where my father worked a job he did not like, and my mother taught elementary school. And every June, almost as soon as school let out, they would load me into the back of their station wagon and drive me down to my grandfather's place and leave me there for most of July and August. I think, looking back, that this arrangement suited everyone. My parents got some time to themselves. My grandfather got company in a house that had grown too quiet after my grandmother died in 1989, and I got the run of 60 acres of pasture and woodlot and the undivided attention of a man who had more patience for a boy's questions than my father ever did. The farm was small by any serious measure. My grandfather kept about 20 head of cattle, 2 horses, a handful of chickens, and a garden that my grandmother had tended before she passed, and that my grandfather kept going in her memory. The house was a low, white farmhouse that his father had built in 1922, with a wide porch and a tin roof and a small apple orchard on the west side. The pasture ran east from the house, sloping gently, down toward a shallow creek, and beyond the creek, the land climbed up into a mixed, hardwood woodlot that belonged, officially, to a neighbor whose property we rarely saw anyone on. The east fence line of the pasture ran along the edge of that creek. It was a 3-wire barbed wire fence strung between cedar posts that my grandfather's father had, set sometime in the 1930s. Some of the original posts were still standing when I was a boy. Most had been replaced over the years, but always in the same line, along the same ground, because that was where the fence had always gone. The first summer I was old enough to stay up past dark, which must have been the summer I was 7, my grandfather sat me down on the porch steps after dinner and told me there was one rule he needed me to remember while I was on the farm. He said it without drama. He said it the way he told me not to leave the barn door open at night, or not to feed the dog table scraps, or not to walk barefoot in the creek because of copperheads. He said, "After the sun goes down, you stay away from the east fence line. Don't walk out that way. Don't go down to the creek to look at the stars. Don't cut across from the barn to the east pasture. You stay up by the house or the barn or the west field. The east fence is off limits after dark. You understand me?" I said I did. "Good," he said. "That's just how we do things here. You'll get used to it." He did not explain. I did not ask. I was 7 years old, and I loved my grandfather, and the rule seemed no stranger than any of the other country rules I was learning. I kept it, and for the next 4 summers, I did not go near the east fence after dark. But I noticed things. I started noticing them when I was about 9, on the porch in the evenings, when the fireflies were coming up over the pasture and the sky over the eastern ridge was turning that deep blue that comes just before night really settles. My grandfather would look out toward the east. It was a quick look, a small glance, and then he would turn his head away. I noticed that he did it every evening. I noticed that he did it at the same point, in the fading light, every time, as if he were checking for something I did not ask him about. Yet there was something in the way he did it, the smallness and the quickness of the glance, that told me it was not a thing to be discussed. And I started hearing the humming. It was faint. It came on certain still nights, when the windows in the farmhouse were open, because there was no air conditioning, and the summer nights were too warm to sleep with. Everything closed. The hum came from the direction of the east fence, drifting across the pasture in the still air, just barely audible if you were awake and paying attention. It sounded, to my ear, like a woman humming a tune to herself, the way a woman might hum, while she hung laundry or worked in a garden. No words, just the rise and fall of a melody I did not recognize. It came maybe once or twice a week, always late, always after I had been in bed for an hour or more. I lay in the upstairs bedroom where my mother had slept when she was a child, and I listened, and I did not go tell my grandfather about it. I think now that I should have told him. I think he probably would have handled it better if I had. But I was a boy who had started to think of himself as no longer a small child, and I had started to want reasons for rules. And the humming was, I thought, a clue to what I was not being allowed to know. The summer I was 11, I broke the rule. It was mid-July, a Tuesday, I think, though I am less sure of the day than I am of almost everything else about that night. I had been hearing the humming for 2 weeks by then, maybe 3. It had come that evening, soft and clear, drifting in through my open window, around 10. I lay in bed and I listened to it, and I made up my mind. My grandfather went to bed early. He was in his bedroom downstairs, off the kitchen, by 9:30 every night. By 10 o'clock, the house was quiet. I waited until 10:30. I got up. I was already dressed, having pulled my clothes back on under the covers. I pulled on my sneakers. I crept down the stairs, skipping the 5th step from the bottom that always creaked, and I let myself out the back door and into the yard. The night was warm and still. The moon was about 2/3 full, and the sky was clear. I could see the pasture clearly in the moonlight, the grass, silver, and the shapes of the cattle in, the near pasture visible as darker shapes against the ground. I walked east from the barn, across the near pasture, through the gate in the middle fence, and out toward the east fence. It took me maybe 10 minutes to get there. The humming had stopped by the time I left the house. The only sounds were the crickets and the occasional low call of a cow back toward the barn. I reached the east fence. The barbed wire glinted in the moonlight. Beyond the fence, the land sloped gently down to the creek, and beyond the creek the woods rose up in a dark wall. I stood with my hand on the top wire, and I looked north along the line. The fence ran, straight for about a quarter mile, before it dog-legged around a big beech tree near a corner post. I looked south. The fence ran the other direction about the same distance before it disappeared into a stand of young cedars. There was a girl walking along the other side of the fence, coming toward me from the north. I saw her right away, in the moonlight. She was maybe 40 yards away. She was about my age, 11 or 12, no older. She was wearing a pale nightgown that came down to her ankles. Her hair was long and dark. She was barefoot. She was walking slowly, not fast, at the easy, unhurried pace of a person on a walk. They had no particular reason to end. Her right hand was trailing along the top wire of the fence, her fingers running across the barbs. She was looking straight ahead, south, past me, as if she had a destination she knew and was simply making her way there. I did not move. I stood with my hand on the wire and I watched her come. She was not, I want to say, a frightening sight at that moment. She looked like a girl. She looked like any neighbor's daughter who might have been sleepwalking, or, more likely, who had been sent out for some country chore in her nightgown and had decided to take the long way home. Her face, in the moonlight, was pale but clear. Her eyes were open. She was not smiling. She was not crying. She was just walking. She got closer. 30 yards. 20. She had not looked at me. Her pace had not changed. Her hand kept moving along the top wire, her fingers crossing the barbs as if the wire were the smooth rail of a porch. When she was maybe 15 feet away, I noticed that the wire was not moving. I had been leaning lightly on the top wire while I stood there, and it had flexed a little under my weight. Her fingers, which appeared to be running firmly along the wire, were not flexing it at all. She was touching it clearly, deliberately. The wire was not being touched. She was making the motion. The wire was not receiving it. Something in my chest did a slow, cold turn. I could have stayed silent. I could have stood still and let her walk past me. That was what I should have done. My grandfather had told me so, without telling me why. In the calm, practical way he told me everything. But I was 11 and I was fascinated, and I thought that perhaps, if I could only say something, she would turn and look at me, and I would find out who she was. She was about 10 feet away. "Hello?" I said. My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. It cracked a little on the second syllable. She did not turn her head. She did not slow. She did not acknowledge me in any way. She kept walking, her hand on the wire, her pace unchanged. She passed in front of me, no more than 4 feet from me on the other side of the fence. and I could see her face clearly in the moonlight. She was not looking at me. She was looking south, ahead of her. At some point I could not see. I turned as she walked past. I watched her go. She did not look back. She walked at the same even pace, her hand running along the wire, her feet moving one after the other in the grass. I followed her, not on her side, but on mine, staying a few feet from the fence, walking parallel to her. I did not touch the wire. I did not speak again. I followed her for almost a quarter mile. She walked south toward the cedar stand where the fence line disappeared. The cedars were thick and low, a dark mass against the moonlit ground. She walked into the shadow of the first cedars, her pale nightgown going from clearly visible to a fainter shape as the shadow took her, and then she was no longer there. I want to be very clear. She did not turn. She did not step off into the brush. She did not walk into deeper shadow. She was there, and then she was not. Between one step and the next, her shape simply ceased to be a shape. I stopped. I stood at the fence line in the moonlight, at the edge of the cedars, and I listened. The crickets were still chirping. The night was otherwise silent. No sound of feet in leaves. No rustle of nightgown fabric. No sense, anywhere beyond the fence, that a person was still moving. I turned and I walked back to the house. I did not run. I walked steadily, the way you walk, when you are trying to pretend to yourself that you are not afraid. I let myself in the back door. I went up the stairs, skipping the 5th step. I got back into bed in my clothes, my sneakers still on my feet, and I lay there with my eyes open, and I waited for the morning. My grandfather came downstairs at 5:30, the way he always did. I was already sitting at the kitchen table. He looked at me. He saw my face. He did not say anything for a long moment. He went to the stove and he set the coffee pot on the burner and he lit the gas. He came back to the table and he sat down across from me and he waited. I told him about the humming I had been hearing. I told him about sneaking out. I told him about the girl and the nightgown and the hair and the way her hand had not moved the wire and the way she had disappeared into the shadow of the cedars. I told him I had called out to her. He listened without interrupting. He did not look surprised. He did not look angry. When I was finished, he got up, poured 2 cups of coffee, brought them back to the table, and set one down in front of me. I had never been allowed coffee before. He said, "Drink that. It'll settle you." I drank it. It was bitter and strong. I drank it anyway. Then he told me that the girl had walked the east fence line for as long as his father had owned the Beck farm, which was since 1922. His father had seen her the first summer they lived on the farm, and his father's father, back before the family had come to Kentucky, had known about things like her and had told his son what to do if he ever saw one. He said nobody knew who she was. No one had ever been able to find out. She had been walking that fence line, he said, for at least 70 years, which meant she had been walking it for longer than he himself had been alive. She did not age. She did not change her clothes. She always walked south. She always walked slowly. She always traced her hand along the wire, and she had never, in all that time, crossed onto their land. His father had watched her, that first time, to see whether she would climb the fence or step through the wires. She had not. She had simply walked on her side of the line, and she had never come over. He looked at me across the kitchen table. He said, "You called out to her?" "Yes." He nodded. He took a long sip of his coffee. He said, "Here's the thing. She's never crossed. Not in 70-some years. But we don't know why. We don't know what keeps her on her side of the fence. And the one rule we know, the rule my father's father knew and passed down, is that you do not call out to her. You do not speak to her, because we don't know what would happen if she answered. And we don't know what would happen if someone, one of these nights, called out to her and she decided to come across." I asked him, "Will she come across now?" He did not answer for a long time. Finally, he said, "I don't know, son. I hope not. Maybe she didn't hear you. Maybe she can't hear. Maybe the rule works in her favor too and keeps her on her side whether she wants to be on it or not. I've never called out to her. My father never did. His father never did. You're the first one in our family that we know of. So, I don't know. I'm going to tell you the same thing my father told me. Don't do it again. Stay away from the east fence at night for the rest of your time here. And I will watch, and we will see. Nothing happened that summer. Nothing happened the summer after, or the summer after that. I continued to come up to the farm every June, and my grandfather continued to keep his cattle. And on still summer nights, I continued, sometimes, to hear the humming through my open window. I never got up again. I never went out. I kept to the rule. My grandfather died in 2006. He was 81. He died in the farmhouse, in his own bed, in the room off the kitchen. He had told me, on a visit the year before, that he was tired and that he thought his time was coming. He was right. My mother inherited the farm. She could not run it, and none of us lived close enough to try. And she rented the pasture to a neighbor and let the house fall into the quiet decline that empty houses fall into. She sold the place in 2011 to a couple from out of state. I have not been back. I am 41 now. I have a daughter. She is 9. I have been thinking, over the past year or so, about what I need to tell her, about whether the rule, which was made for a fence line, on a farm that no longer belongs to my family, still applies to her, about whether some rules are about the place and some are about the blood, about whether the girl in the nightgown, who walked that fence for 70 years and had never crossed, is still walking it now, or whether, on some summer night long after I last saw her, she finally turned her head and answered someone who had called out to her and crossed. I do not know. My grandfather did not know either, but I think, on the bad nights, about the small cold turn my chest did when I saw that the wire was not moving under her hand, and I think about how she passed so close to me that I could have reached out and touched her, and I think about what would have happened if I had. I think about these things, and then I get up and I check my daughter's room, and I watch her sleep, and I remind myself that we live in a city now, and that there are no farms in our family anymore, and no fences, and nothing to cross over from. And then I go back to bed, and I tell myself, as my grandfather told himself for 70 years, that the rule has held so far, and that it will keep holding, and that it is the kind of thing you can make peace with if you do not let yourself think about it too often. I was 15. The summer my cousins took me out to the clearing in the woods behind their property in West Virginia, and it has been 30 years now, and I still think about that night, more often than I would like to admit. My father's family had been on that land since sometime in the 1850s, a stretch of hollow and ridge in the mountains north of Lewisburg, and my uncle ran the home place, while my father had moved off to Ohio for work when he was a young man. Every summer of my childhood, my parents had driven me back down to my uncle's house for 2 or 3 weeks, the way people do when they want their children to know where they come from. The farm sat on a shoulder of a ridge, with pasture running down to the county road in front, and woods climbing up behind the house for a long way, maybe 400 acres of hardwood and rhododendron that the family had never logged, and that my uncle talked about sometimes, as if it were a member of the family in its own right. I had 3 male cousins close to me in age that summer. Ben, the oldest, was 17, and the quietest of the 3. He had grown up on the farm and he knew the woods the way you know the rooms of your own house. Daniel was 16, louder, always trying to make the rest of us laugh. Casey was 14, the youngest, and he followed the rest of us around with the earnest desperation of a boy who wanted very badly to be treated as one of the older ones. I was the city cousin. I lived in a suburb outside Cincinnati. I was clumsy in the woods. I did not know how to tell a rat snake from a copperhead. I had to be taught each summer how to do things my cousins had known how to do since they were small. But they were patient with me, especially Ben, and that summer I had started to feel, for the first time, as though I was starting to belong on the farm rather than just visiting it. The bonfire spot was a family tradition going back further than any living person. It sat in a clearing in the woods about a mile from my uncle's house, on a flat bench of ground at the fire, head of the hollow, where a small creek came down off the ridge. There was a ring of stacked stones in the middle of the clearing that my great-grandfather had built sometime in the 1930s. The stones smoke-blackened from decades of fires. A few old logs set around it. As seating, the clearing was surrounded by tall oaks and hickories that arched over it like a kind of natural room, their branches high enough that even a proper bonfire would not throw sparks up to them. The family had held gatherings in that clearing for as long as anyone could remember. The 4th of July was the big one. Every summer, on July 5th, my uncle and my father and the various extended cousins and their wives and children walked up to the clearing at dusk, built a fire taller than a man, ate hot dogs and drank beer, and told stories until the mosquitoes drove them home. It was as close to a sacred ritual as my family had. That year, the 4th of July fell on a Friday, and the family bonfire was planned for Saturday, the 5th. On Friday evening, around 7, Ben suggested that the 4 of us boys hike up to the clearing to get it ready. He meant to gather some wood and stack it by the ring, clear any fallen branches, check that the stones were all in good order, and save my uncle the trouble of doing it himself the next afternoon. It was a job the adults had always done, and Ben wanted to surprise his father. I remember being pleased to be included. I remember feeling, as we set out, that I was being treated as one of the men. We left the house just before 7:30. The sun was still up, but it had dropped behind the western ridge and the hollow was sliding into blue shadow. We walked out the back gate of the yard, across a hayfield, and up into the woods by way of an old logging road that ran up the ridge. It was a walk I had done many times. We carried 2 shovels, a black trash bag, a thermos of ice water, and a small cooler with a few Cokes in it. We were not expecting to be long. The logging road became a footpath as it climbed toward the head of the hollow. The path ran along the side of the creek for the last quarter mile before it opened out into the clearing. It was a walk of maybe 40 minutes at an easy pace. The 4 of us made it in casual conversation. Daniel was trying to make the rest of us laugh about something a girl had said. At a 4th of July parade that morning, Casey was asking me questions about high school in Ohio. Ben walked at the front, quiet, the way he always walked, leading without needing to say anything. It was getting on toward full dusk when we came around the last bend in the path and the clearing came into view. There was a bonfire burning in it. I want to describe this carefully, because I have turned the details over in my head 1,000 times since, and I want to get them right. The fire was not small. It was not a campfire. It was a proper bonfire, the kind my family built for the 5th of July. A tall stack of split hardwood logs arranged in a careful teepee shape inside the old stone ring. The flames were reaching 6, maybe 7 feet above the top of the stack. The fire was burning, cleanly, in the practiced way well-seasoned oak and hickory burn when they are properly laid and properly lit. The orange light of it was throwing a wash of color across the clearing, lighting up the trunks of the surrounding oaks, reflecting off the undersides of their lowest branch. The clearing was empty. No one was sitting on the logs. No one was standing in the firelight. There were no tents, no coolers, no lawn chairs, no gear of any kind. There were no people visible anywhere in the clearing or at its edges. There was only the fire, burning tall and healthy, throwing its light into the gathering dusk in a place where no fire had any reason to be. The 4 of us stopped at the edge of the path. None of us spoke. We stood there in the dim, blue light at the clearing's edge, and we looked at the fire, and for what must have been 30 seconds, we just stood and stared. Daniel quietly said, "Is somebody out here?" Ben did not answer. He was looking around the edges of the clearing. I followed his gaze. I could see a little way into the woods on every side, and there was no one visible. No shapes at the edge of the trees. No one sitting on one of the logs. Nobody anywhere, as far as I could tell, near the fire. Casey said, "Ben?" Ben did not answer him either. He was very still. I looked more carefully at the fire. Something about it was not right, in a way I could not immediately name. The fire was tall, and it was burning clean, and it had been going long, enough to have built up a good bed of coals at the base. That would have required at least an hour of burning, and it would have required someone to have laid it and lit it and tended it. Someone had built this fire. But the ground around the ring, where a person building a fire would have walked back and forth a dozen times, where the grass would have been beaten down and the leaves brushed aside, was undisturbed. The grass around the ring was smooth. There were no footprints in the patch of bare soft earth I could see near the nearest log. There was no wheelbarrow track from where firewood might have been brought in. There were no small chips of wood or curls of bark on the ground from where someone might have split kindling. And there was no smell. I want to be very clear about this. A bonfire of that size, burning well-seasoned hardwood, would have filled the clearing with smoke. The smell of wood smoke is unmistakable. It would have been in our noses from the moment we came around the bend in the path. I smelled no smoke. I looked at my cousins. None of them were wrinkling their noses. None of them were coughing. The fire was burning, and it was throwing light, and even the heat of it, which should have been reaching us across 40 feet of clearing, was not. The air where we stood was the same cool summer dusk air it had been on the path. Ben, in a quiet, level voice, said, "Don't step into the clearing. Back up onto the path. Back up. Slowly. Don't turn your back to the fire until we're around the bend." His voice was steady. It was his normal voice. But there was something underneath it, a tightness that I had never heard from him before. Ben had been our leader since we were small boys. He had never once, in all the summers I had spent on the farm, sounded frightened of anything. We backed up. We did not speak. We stepped backward along the path, one after the other. Casey first, then me, then Daniel, then Ben bringing up the rear. We went maybe 20 or 25 feet before we reached the bend, and then Ben, quietly, said, "Now turn. Now. Walk, don't run. Walk steady." We turned. We walked. The light from the clearing faded behind us. Ben walked directly behind me, and I could hear his breath, and I knew he was listening for anything following. We did not speak until we reached the logging road at the edge of the hayfield. By then, the clearing was most of a mile behind us. The woods had gone fully dark. We could see the lights of my uncle's farmhouse across the pasture. Ben stopped us at the edge of the trees, and he looked at each of us in turn. "We are not going to tell anyone about this," he said. "Not my dad, not your uncles, not my mom, not anyone. We saw it. We did what we were supposed to do. We walked away. Tomorrow morning, before the family comes up for the cookout, we are going to walk back to the clearing in daylight, the four of us, and we are going to do the work we were supposed to do tonight. And we are not going to talk about this. Not then, and not now, and not ever. Do you understand?" Daniel opened his mouth. "Daniel," Ben said. Daniel closed his mouth. "You saw it too. You smell any smoke on your clothes?" None of us smelled any smoke on our clothes. We had been standing 40 feet from a bonfire for more than a minute. We should have come home reeking of it. We did not. Ben looked at me. "My grandfather told me about this fire when I was 12. Exactly once. He said his own grandfather had told him. He said if we ever saw it, we were to turn around and walk away, and we were not to accept what was being offered. He said the people who lived on this land before our family were here knew about it. They had their own rules. The old men who were still alive in the 1880s taught my great-great-grandfather what the rules were, and the rules have been passed down in our family ever since. Tomorrow, the clearing will be empty. I promise it will. Tomorrow, we will have our cookout. Everything will be normal. But tonight, we walked up on something that was not meant for us, and we did what we were supposed to do, and we are not going to talk about it." Casey was crying. I had not noticed when it started. He was not making any sound, but tears were running down his face in the dark. He was 14 years old. I reached over and I squeezed his shoulder. He did not say anything. He just nodded. We walked across the hayfield to the farmhouse. My uncle was on the back porch drinking a beer. He asked how the clearing looked. Ben said it looked good. My uncle asked if we had stacked the wood. Ben said we had done enough to have a head start on the next day. He did not mention the fire. None of us mentioned the fire. We went inside and we ate a late dinner, leftover pot roast that my aunt had made, and we went to bed. I lay in the upstairs bedroom I shared with Casey, and I listened to the small, ordinary sounds of the farmhouse at night, and I waited for morning. At 10 the next morning, the four of us walked out to the clearing in the bright July sunlight. The woods were warm. Cicadas were humming in the higher branches of the oaks. We came around the same bend in the path, and we stepped into the clearing. It was empty. There was no fire. There was no stack of logs. The stone ring sat in the middle of the grass, where it had always sat, blackened from the previous year's bonfires, but cold and undisturbed. There were no fresh ashes in it. There were no burnt embers. There was no disturbed earth around it. There were no signs anywhere that anything had been burning in that clearing the night before. The grass around the ring was the same undisturbed grass we had seen in the fading light 12 hours earlier. Ben looked at the ring. He looked at Daniel. He looked at me. Casey just nodded, the way he had the night before, as if he had already expected exactly this. We did the work we had come to do. We gathered wood and stacked it. We swept the clearing with a broom we had brought. We checked the stone ring for loose stones. We talked normally while we worked about other things. None of us mentioned the fire. That evening, at dusk, my uncle and my father, who had driven down from Ohio for the weekend, and the rest of the family walked up to the clearing for the cookout. My uncle lit the fire with his grandfather's old Zippo lighter, the way he always did. The fire caught and grew and burned tall and clean for hours. We ate hot dogs. The adults drank beer. The children drank Cokes. We told stories. It smelled like wood smoke. Our clothes smelled like wood smoke when we walked back down to the farmhouse at midnight. It was a normal and good family evening. On the walk back, I fell in beside Ben. When we were out of earshot of the others, he said, quietly, "My grandfather told me something else that one time. He told me the fire in the clearing is an offering. He said it is built for you. He said if you sit down at it, if you eat anything that might be there, if you warm your hands at it, you become part of it." Part of what? I don't know. My grandfather didn't know either. He said his grandfather had said the fire has been there longer than our family has, and it will be there longer than we will be, and that the only thing you can do is know the rule and pass it down. I asked him, then, if anyone in our family had ever gone to the fire. Ben walked in silence for a long way. Then he said, "My grandfather had an uncle, ran off from the farm when he was 16 on a July night in 1918. They always said he had gone west to look for work. His mother said until the day she died that he had not run off. She said he had gone for a walk in the woods and never come back. They never found him. My grandfather thought, maybe, but he didn't know. I am 45 now. Ben still lives on the farm. My uncle passed in 2014, and my father the year after. Ben runs the place with his wife and their own kids, and we still have the 4th of July cookout every year, though I have only been able to make it back about every other year since my own kids were born. I have never seen the fire in the clearing again. Ben has told me, quietly, over the years, that it has appeared to him twice more in his adulthood. Both times he was the one who first saw it coming around the bend in the path, and both times he walked the others away. He thinks it shows up more often for our family than for most, and he is not sure why. He has told his own sons the rule. I have told my own son, he is 13. He looked at me strangely when I told him. The way you look at a parent telling you something you do not want to believe. But I told him anyway. He will be old enough soon to go up into the hollow without me, and he needs to know. I do not know what the fire is. I do not know who built it, or who lit it, or who it is waiting for. Only that 4 of us walked up on it on a July night in 1995, and that none of us sat down, and that we walked away the way Ben told us to walk away. And I know that Ben's great-great-uncle is still missing, somewhere in the land that belonged to his family for 170 years, and that the fire, on some summer nights, is still there, tall, clean and smokeless, waiting patiently for someone who does not know the rule, or for someone who knows the rule but is too tired, or too cold, or too lonely to remember it. There was a swimming hole on the creek behind my uncle's property in southwestern Virginia, and for the first 16 years of my life, it was the most beautiful place I knew. My uncle owned a small piece of land tucked back into a valley about an hour outside of Roanoke, a stretch of pasture and woodlot and creek bottom that had been in the family since before my grandfather was born. He had no children of his own. He and my aunt had wanted them, I know now, and had not been able to have them. And so, during the summers of my childhood, their house became the gathering place for all of the nieces and nephews. My 3 cousins and I spent most of every July and August at that farm, from the time we were small until we were finally too old to want to spend our summers with relatives. The swimming hole was a half-mile walk from my uncle's back porch, down a narrow path, through a stand of old hemlocks to a bend in the creek where the water deepened and slowed. On the far side of the bend, the creek had cut into the bank over centuries, carving out a pool that was shoulder deep in the middle, even in late summer, when the rest of the stream had gone thin. The water was cold year-round, fed by a spring somewhere up the hollow. The sycamores that grew on either bank were enormous, old enough to have been there when my great-grandfather had been a boy, and their pale trunks and broad leaves shaded the pool so deeply that even on the hottest July afternoons, the swimming hole stayed cool. Every child in our family had learned to swim there. My father had learned there. My uncle had learned there. My cousins and I had learned there, taught by my uncle, who had been a strong swimmer all his life. My uncle had one rule about the swimming hole, and he had it from the time I was old, enough to understand. You did not go down to the water after dark, not with the other cousins, not with a flashlight, not even to dip your feet off the flat rock on the near bank. The swimming hole was a daytime place. When the sun got low over the western ridge and the hemlocks started to go blue in the shadows, you picked up your towel and your shoes and you walked back up the path to the house. That was the rule. My uncle was a kind man, a patient man, and he almost never raised his voice, but I remember him speaking about that rule with a seriousness that none of us questioned. My 3 cousins and I knew the rule. We had known it all our lives. We kept it for most of our lives without thinking much about why. I was 16 the summer I broke it. That year, for the first time, my parents had let me drive myself down to my uncle's place in my own car, a used Ford Escort they had bought me for my birthday. I arrived on the second weekend of July, and 2 of my cousins were already there. My cousin Jake, who was 17 that summer, and his younger sister Lauren, who was 15. We spent the first week of my visit doing the things we had always done. We swam during the afternoons. We helped my uncle with chores in the mornings. We ate my aunt's cooking and stayed up too late playing cards on the screened-in porch. On the second Thursday of my visit, it got hot. I mean the kind of hot that southwestern Virginia gets in a wet July, when the air feels like a warm, damp cloth pressed against your face, and the sun stops mattering because the humidity alone is enough to pin you to a porch chair. My uncle said at dinner that he had not seen a July that hot in 10 years. My aunt fanned herself with a folded magazine. None of us could sleep that night. I lay in my upstairs bedroom with the window open and a box fan running at the foot of the bed, and the air coming through the fan was just warm air being moved around. Around 11:30, I heard a soft tap on my door. Jake was in the hallway in his clothes. He whispered that he could not sleep either, and that he was going down to the swimming hole to cool off. And did I want to come? I did not hesitate. I was 16. Jake was 17. The rule my uncle had taught us our whole lives felt in that moment like the kind of childhood thing you outgrew. And this was, I think, the beginning of when we were supposed to start outgrowing it. I pulled on shorts and a t-shirt. I grabbed the small flashlight I kept on my nightstand. I met Jake in the downstairs hall. and we let ourselves out the back door into the night. The air outside was no cooler than the air in the house. The moon was about 3/4, full and high in the sky, and the yard was bright with silver light. We walked across the back pasture toward the tree line. Jake was ahead of me. Neither of us spoke. We found the head of the path at the edge of the hemlocks, and we stepped into the trees, and the darkness closed over us. The path was narrow and steep, and I clicked my flashlight on to see my footing. The hemlocks were old and tall and packed close together, and their branches overhead blocked most of the moonlight. Jake had his own flashlight and was walking ahead of me. We did not speak. Something about the woods at night, even on a piece of land I had known all my life, made us quieter than we were in the daytime. The path descended gently for about 400 yards before it leveled out at the edge of the creek. I could hear the water running over the stones before I could see it. We came around the last bend, and the path opened onto the small grassy area where we kept our towels and snacks during the daytime. The swimming hole was in front of us. The water was glassy. The moonlight was full on it because the canopy of sycamores opened up directly above the pool, and the silver light came down cleanly and lit the surface of the person, water like a piece of sheet metal. There was someone in the swimming hole. We saw her at the same time. Jake was ahead of me, and he had just started to walk toward the flat rock where we usually sat, and he stopped. I stopped behind him. We both raised our flashlights, and then we both lowered them because the moonlight was enough, and the flashlights did not help. A woman was floating on her back in the middle of the pool. In the deepest part, she was completely still. Her body lay flat on the surface of the water in the way a body floats when a person is deliberately relaxing and letting the water hold them. Her arms were slightly out to her sides, her palms up. Her legs were together and floating. Her head was tilted back, and her face was turned toward the sky, and her eyes, as far as I could tell from the path, were open and looking straight up at the stars. Her hair was long and very dark, and it fanned out around her head on the surface of the water like ink in milk, spreading in a slow, uneven circle. Her skin was very pale. Her clothes, if she was wearing any, were dark, though it was hard to tell in the moonlight exactly what she had on. She might have been naked. She might have been wearing a dark dress. I could not tell. She did not move. I watched her. Jake watched her. For maybe 10 seconds, neither of us did anything but look. I was waiting, I realize now, for her to do what a person floating in the water does. I was waiting for her to draw a breath, or shift a leg, or tilt her head, or do some small living thing that a person in the water cannot help but do. She did not. Her chest did not rise. Her fingers did not move. The water around her was not disturbed, except for the slow spreading fan of her hair. She was floating the way a leaf floats, and a leaf does not breathe. The moonlight was strong enough that I could see her face clearly. She was a grown woman, maybe in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. Her features were not twisted. Her mouth was closed. Her eyes were open. She was beautiful in the way moonlight makes people beautiful, pale and still and perfectly composed. She did not look like a drowning woman. She did not look like a dead woman. She looked like a woman who had lain down on top of the water on purpose, and who had decided to rest there for a while, looking up at the stars. Jake grabbed my arm. He grabbed it hard enough that he left a bruise on my forearm that stayed for a week. He did not say anything. He just held on to me, and he began to pull me backward, back up the path. I did not resist. I turned with him, and we moved together, slowly, back into the hemlocks. We did not run. I want to be clear about that. We did not turn and run. Jake held my arm, and we walked, as quietly as we could, back up the path the way we had come. I did not look back. Jake did not look back. Whatever was in the water stayed where it was, floating on its back, face turned to the stars, hair spreading on the surface, and we walked away from it, and it did not follow. The walk up the path felt longer than it had going down. My legs were shaking. I could hear Jake breathing next to me, quick and shallow. Neither of us spoke when we came out of the hemlocks at the top of the path. The pasture stretched out in front of us in the moonlight, and the farmhouse sat there across the field with its porch light on, small and warm and familiar, and it looked more beautiful to me in that moment than I can tell you. We crossed the pasture. Jake did not let go of my arm until we reached the yard. We let ourselves back into the house through the back door. The downstairs was dark and quiet. My uncle and my aunt were asleep. Lauren was asleep. We crept up the stairs. At the top of the staircase, Jake finally looked at me, and his face in the weak light was pale and drawn, and he put a finger to his lips and shook his head once. He went into his room. I went into mine. I did not sleep. I lay in bed in my clothes for the rest of the night with the fan blowing and the window open and the moonlight coming through the curtains, and I watched the ceiling, and I waited for morning. At 6:30 the next morning, my uncle came downstairs. I was already at the kitchen table. My aunt was at the stove. Jake came down a few minutes after I did. He sat across from me. He did not look at me. My uncle poured himself coffee and sat down at the head of the table. He looked at Jake. He looked at me. Then in a very quiet voice, not angry, almost sad, he said, "Boys, did either of you go down to the creek last night?" Jake and I looked at each other. There was no point in lying. My uncle had known us our whole lives. I do not know what he had heard or seen. Maybe he had heard the back door. Maybe he had not heard anything and had only felt it. Maybe he had been waking up at night for years and checking, and had finally that one morning had to ask. "Yes, sir," Jake said. My uncle nodded slowly. He set his coffee cup down. He looked down at the wood of the kitchen table for a long moment. My aunt at the stove had gone very still. She was not cooking anymore. She was just standing there with the spatula in her hand, her back to us. Finally, my uncle said, "Did you see something in the water?" "Yes, sir," Jake said again. My uncle closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were shining though. He did not cry. He looked at us both, and he said, "You boys were lucky last night. Do you understand me? You were very lucky." "Lucky how?" I asked. My voice came out thin. My uncle did not answer at first. He took a sip of his coffee. He looked past us, out the kitchen window, at the pasture and the hemlocks beyond, where the path to the creek started. He said, "My father told me about her when I was about your age." He said his father had told him, and his father's father before that. "She is a thing that belongs to this creek. She has been in that swimming hole for longer than our family has owned this land. She does not come out of it during the day. She is only there at night, and only on certain nights, when the water is right and the moon is right and the air is hot enough. Nobody knows what she is. I have never seen her myself. My father saw her once, when he was 16. He told me exactly what you just saw. A woman floating on her back in the middle of the pool, hair spread out, face to the stars." He paused. He looked at Jake. He looked at me. "The rule my father told me, that his father told him, is that if you see her, you do not go in the water. You do not speak to her. You do not try to help her. You do not call out to her. You turn around and you walk back up the path, and you do not look back. If you do those things, she stays where she is. That is why the rule is no one goes down there after dark. Because some night, one of you boys might have forgotten the rule, or might have thought she was in trouble, or might have tried to be a hero. And my father told me, and his father told him, that the ones who go into the water with her do not come back out." Jake had gone very white. I was cold all over. My uncle said, quietly, "My father had a cousin when he was a boy of about 14. The cousin went down to the creek on a hot night to cool off. His parents found his clothes, folded on the flat rock at dawn. They never found him. My father always believed he had seen her in the water and had not known the rule and had gone to her." My uncle took another sip of his coffee. He looked at both of us for a long moment. He did not make us promise anything. He did not lecture us. He just looked at us with his tired, kind eyes. And I understood, in that look, that he had been afraid of this conversation for most of them, his life, and that he was relieved, in the end, that he had been able to have it with us alive, and not with my aunt over 2 graves. He said, "Don't go down there again at night, ever. Not as long as I'm alive, and not when I'm gone either. That water belongs to her after sunset. Let it belong to her, you hear me?" We said we heard him. Jake and I never spoke about it again, not even to each other. I have kept the rule for the 30 years since. I have not gone down to the swimming hole at night, not once, not even on the hottest summer nights when I visited my uncle as an adult. Not even the summer my aunt died, when I stayed at the farm for a week to help him settle things. My uncle passed 4 years after that. The farm was sold. The new owners are a young family from Maryland. I do not know what they have been told. I do not know if they have a rule for their children. I have hoped, since they moved in, that the woman in the water is only interested in my family and that she will leave these strangers alone. I have hoped this because I do not know how to warn them, and because I am ashamed to say that I have not tried. But on hot July nights, when I cannot sleep in my own house far from Virginia, I sometimes lie awake, and I think about the farm, and I think about the swimming hole, and I think about the moonlight on the water, and the slow fan of dark hair, and a pale face turned up to the stars. And I wonder whether a child I do not know is walking down a path I know by heart, with a flashlight in his hand, toward something his parents have not known to tell him about. And I hope, on the bad nights, that he has the sense to turn around, that some instinct older than the rule will grab his arm, the way my cousin grabbed mine, and drag him back up the path, away from the water, toward the yellow light of a porch that still remembers how to hold people safe. My father used to take me camping in the Pisgah National Forest every August, when I was a boy. It was a tradition he had inherited from his own father, one of those Appalachian family customs that gets passed down without anyone quite deciding to keep it. Every year, sometime in the 2nd or 3rd week of August, he would take a week off work, and he would load the back of his old Chevrolet pickup with his gear and my gear, and we would drive up from our house outside of Asheville into the mountains, and we would spend 4 or 5 nights sleeping in a canvas tent on a piece of ground that he had chosen from somewhere in his own memory of childhood. My father was not a talkative man. He did not tell me much about why he took me camping every August, only that his father had taken him and his grandfather had taken his father, and the men in our family had done this since before anyone could remember. He made it sound like a kind of duty. I understood, even when I was young, that it was something more than a vacation. My father knew the Pisgah the way a person knows the rooms of a house. He had grown up 15 miles from the forest boundary, and he had worked summers on a trail crew there. When he was a young man, he knew old roads that had not been maintained since the 1950s. He knew small creeks that did not appear on any hiking map. He knew the places where his own father had taken him, and he took me to some of them, though not all. There were certain spots, he told me once, that he would not camp at. He did not explain why. He just said, "Those places are for your grandfather's memory, not mine," and I accepted that, the way a boy accepts the things his father says when he cannot yet tell the difference between superstition and wisdom. The summer I was 10, we drove up on a Tuesday morning in the middle of August. It had been a hot, wet summer, and the woods were lush and heavy with growth, the rhododendron thickets pressing in on every logging road, the air thick with the smell of damp leaves and moss. My father drove for almost 2 hours, moving further and further from any paved road, turning onto dirt tracks that wound up into the hills, choosing turns without hesitation, as if he had a map in his head that he was reading as he went. At one point we passed an old gate that had been left open, half fallen off its hinges. The logging road behind it was narrow and overgrown, the brush on either side brushing the sides of the truck. He turned onto it, and we drove another 2 miles at a creep before the road opened out into a small flat hollow at the base of a low ridge. The hollow was beautiful. A small creek came down out of the ridge and widened into a shallow stream that ran through the middle of the clearing before disappearing back into the Woods on the far side. The ground was flat and grassy, with a scattering of old fallen logs that had gone soft with moss. Tall tulip poplars and hickories ringed the clearing, their trunks straight and pale, and the light came down through the canopy in shifting patches of green and gold. My father parked the truck at the edge of the clearing. He looked around for a minute, and then he said, "This is the spot. Get your pack." We set up camp. We pitched the canvas tent on the highest patch of flat ground away from the creek. We built a fire ring out of stones we gathered from the stream bed. We gathered firewood and stacked it under a tarp. My father showed me, as he had every year, how to hang our food bag from a high branch to keep the bears out of it. We ate a simple supper of beans and cornbread cooked over the fire, and we sat around the embers until the sky through the canopy had gone from blue to black, and the first stars had appeared in the patches of open sky above the clearing. Around 10, my father banked the fire, and we crawled into the tent. The tent was an old canvas wall tent, the kind that smelled of decades of wood smoke and mildew in the way only old canvas does. We had 2 cots inside it, both of them my father's own, one of which I slept on. I got into my sleeping bag. My father got into his. He turned off the lantern. The tent went dark. I could hear the small creek running in the clearing. I could hear the wind moving in the high branches of the poplars. I fell asleep within minutes, the way children sleep. I woke up because I was hearing singing. I want to tell you exactly what I remember, because I have gone over it many times in the 41 years since that night. The singing was a woman's voice. It was not close, but it was clear. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the hollow, beyond the clearing where we were camped, further up the small valley toward wherever the creek was coming from. The voice was singing a slow melody, a wordless one, no lyrics that I could make out, the kind of tune an old woman might hum to herself while she was working at something, hanging sheets on a line or kneading dough for biscuits. It had the cadence of an old song, the rise and fall of a melody that had been sung in the mountains for a very long time. I lay very still in my sleeping bag and I listened. The voice was not high and young. It was a woman's voice in middle age, or past it, the kind of voice that had sung for a long time and had grown comfortable in its own range. It was not loud. It was not trying to be heard. It was the kind of singing a person does when they are alone, when they have forgotten that anyone might be listening, when the song is simply for themselves and the work of their hands. I turned my head in the dark. I could see my father's shape on his cot beside me. He was already awake. I could see the shine of his eyes and the faint light that came through the canvas walls. He was very still. He was listening too. I started to speak. I was going to whisper to him and ask him what it was. Before I could make a sound, he reached over in the dark and he put his hand on my chest, pressing me gently down into my cot. His other hand came up and he put a finger against my mouth. He did not say anything. He just held me there with his hand on my chest and his finger at my lips, and he shook his head once in the dark. I understood. I did not speak. I did not get up. I did not go to the tent door to look out. I lay on my cot with my father's hand on my chest, and I listened. The singing continued. It went on for a long time. I know now that it was close to 2 hours because I looked at my watch when we finally got up the next morning, and I remembered what time I had fallen asleep the night before, and I did the arithmetic. At the time, in the middle of the night, it felt endless. The voice sang and sang. It never got closer. It never got farther away. It simply was there in the dark, a steady, wordless, slow song coming from somewhere up the hollow, as if the woman who was singing it were working at some long, patient task and was content to sing to herself while she did it. My father did not move. I did not move. The hand he had placed on my chest stayed there, the pressure light and warm through my sleeping bag. I felt his hand there the whole time. I felt the small rise and fall of his breath beside me. Once or twice, very slowly, he tightened, his hand on my chest, a small reassuring squeeze, the way a father tells a frightened child. without words, that everything is all right, that he is still there, that he is not going anywhere. I I was grateful for it in a way I could not have put into words at 10 years old, and can barely put into words now. My father was not a demonstrative man. His hand on my chest in the dark that night is, I think, the most love I ever felt from him at one time, before or since. The singing continued. There were stretches when I thought I could almost make out a word, or the suggestion of a word in the tune. A syllable that sounded like the beginning of an English word, or a word in some older language, something with long vowels and soft consonants. But every time I leaned toward it, trying to hear, the word would slip away, and the melody would continue, wordless, and I would wonder whether I had imagined it. The singer, whoever she was, never broke into clear speech. She only sang, around what I later figured out was 1:45 in the morning. The singing stopped. It did not taper. It did not fade. The voice sang one last slow phrase, a descending line that sounded like the end of something, and then the hollow went silent. The only sounds left were the creak, and the wind in the poplars, and my father's breathing. My father kept his hand on my chest for a long time after the singing stopped. He did not move. He did not speak. He was listening for something, some sign that whatever had been, singing had gone back to wherever it had come from. I do not know what he was listening for. I only know that he listened, in the dark, for what felt like another hour, and then at some point I fell asleep, and the last thing I remember is the warmth of his hand on me. I woke up at first light. My father was already up. He was not cooking breakfast. He was breaking camp. He had the fire pit scattered and the stones put back in the creek where we had found them. He had the tent halfway down. He moved efficiently and quietly, the way he always moved when he was doing work that needed to be done. When I sat up in my cot, he glanced over at me and he said, quietly, "Pack up your stuff. We're leaving." I did not ask why. I packed my stuff. We were in the truck and driving out of the hollow within 30 minutes. My father did not eat breakfast. I did not eat breakfast. We drove in silence down the overgrown logging road, through the half-fallen gate, and back out onto the dirt tracks, and then the paved roads. We were most of the way home before my father spoke. He said, "We're not going to tell your mother we cut the trip short. We'll tell her the weather turned." "Yes, sir. And we're not going to talk about what we heard last night. Not to anyone. Not to each other. Not ever." "Yes, sir." He drove for another mile. Then, without looking at me, he said, "Your grandfather heard that, one time, in the same hollow, when he was about your age. His father was with him. His father did what I did. They did not answer it. They did not look out of the tent. His father told him, afterward, that the rule had been passed down in our family for longer than anyone remembered why. That was what my own father told me, the summer after his trip. I am telling you now. Do not answer it. Do not look at it. Do not go back to that hollow. That's all. That's the only rule. Your grandfather kept it. I kept it. You will keep it. Your sons, if you have them, will keep it. I kept it. I am 51 years old now, and I have kept it for 41 years, and I have never been back to that hollow, and I do not intend to go. My father died when I was 38. He died of a heart attack at 67 in the yard of the house he and my mother had built, while he was carrying a bucket of water out to a vegetable patch he had been trying to get to grow. He had not been sick. It was sudden. I was at the house within an hour of the call. I helped my mother make the arrangements. A few weeks later, after the funeral and the paperwork, she asked me if I would go through the boxes in his workshop, the things he had kept out there that she did not want to deal with. I went out to the workshop. Most of it was tools. In a small wooden box on a shelf, I found an old cloth-bound notebook, the kind of ledger book that countrymen used to keep accounts in. It was his father's. His father's handwriting was carefully written on the first page, my grandfather's full name, and the year 1937. I turned through the pages. It was a record of expenses, crop yields, weather notes. Toward the back, In a different ink, my grandfather had written a single paragraph, undated, in the middle of an otherwise blank page. The paragraph said, in handwriting that was tight and careful, and that looked like my father's, "Took Billy to the hollow. He heard her. He is a good boy." He did not answer. I told him the rule. He will tell his own son. My father told me, and I have told Billy, and we do not know where the rule came from, and we do not know why she sings, and we do not need to know. We only need to keep the rule, let it pass down. Let my line continue to keep it. God help the one who answers her. I closed the notebook. I put it back in the box. I did not tell my mother. I took the notebook home with me, and I have kept it in a drawer in my own workshop. And when my son turned 10, I took him to the Pisgah National Forest, and I camped with him in a different hollow. And I did not tell him the story, not yet. He is 18 now. He is away at college. He will have his own sons someday, if he has any, and I will tell him before they come along. I will tell him what my father told me, and what my father's father told my father. I will pass the rule down. I will not tell him why. I will not tell him because I do not know why. And because I think, after 41 years of thinking about it, that the not knowing is part of the rule. But some August nights, when I am lying in my own bed in my own house in Asheville, with the windows open and the crickets sounding in the yard, I think about her. I think about the woman in the hollow, singing her slow, wordless song, and about whether she sings every August night, or only on the nights when someone is camped within earshot, or only on the nights when someone from my family is camped within earshot. I think about what she is doing up there, in the dark, at the head of that hollow, working at whatever patient task her song accompanies. I think about the word that almost formed in her singing, the suggestion of a syllable I could never quite catch. I think about what would have happened if I had answered her, what my life would have been, what my father's life would have been, what my grandfather's life would have been. And I am grateful, in a way I cannot explain, that my father put his hand on my chest that night and held it there and kept me still, and that I was young enough to understand without being told. I was fishing a remote stretch of river in eastern Tennessee one July evening with an old friend of mine, a man named Carl who had grown up in those mountains and who had known that river since he was a boy. Carl and I had met in college, two state school kids from opposite ends of the same state, and we had stayed close into our 40s, even though our lives had gone in different directions. He had stayed in the mountains, married a woman from his hometown, and worked for the State Forestry Service. I had moved to Nashville and become a lawyer. Every summer for the past 15 years, I had driven up to visit him for a long weekend, and he had taken me fishing on one of the small rivers he knew in the eastern part of the state. That July, it was my 4th day at his house, and we had driven up to a spot on a small river I had never been to, a piece of water he said he had been going to since he was a boy. The river was beautiful. It was not a famous trout stream. It was not on any list of Tennessee's best fishing waters. It was a small, clear, cold river that ran through a narrow valley in a national forest, and you reached it by driving 30 minutes of rough gravel road, and then hiking a quarter mile down a steep path to the bank. There was a small flat area on the near side where you could set up and wade out into the pools, and the far bank rose up into a steep wooded slope that climbed into the ridge above. I had never seen another fisherman there in the 3 or 4 times Carl had taken me. He said he knew the spot from his grandfather. He said not many people did. We got there around 5 in the afternoon. We had driven up from his house after an early dinner, expecting maybe 3 hours of good light, and one of the long twilights you get in the mountains in July. We rigged our rods at the truck and hiked down to the river and waded in. The water was cold and moving fast. The evening hatch started up a little after 6, and we both caught a few nice small rainbows over the next couple of hours, releasing everything, the way Carl liked to do. The sun dropped behind the ridge behind us around 7. The valley went into shadow. The light on the water turned that deep slate color that evening. Water takes on with only the occasional flash of a fish rising breaking the surface. Carl was maybe 50 feet upstream from me, casting into a riffle. I was working a slow pool below him. Around 8:30, the light was starting to get thin. The river was beginning to lose definition. I was thinking about calling it and hiking out. I knew Carl liked to fish until he literally could not see his fly on the water. But I also knew the hike out was easier in some daylight. I waded over toward him to suggest we pack up. He was already looking at the far bank. He was standing very still in the water, his rod held loosely in his hand, not casting. He was looking across the river at the steep wooded slope on the other side. I followed his gaze. There was a light on the far bank. It was a yellow light, about the size and brightness of a kerosene lantern. It was moving. Along the edge of the water, upstream, at a slow, even walking pace. The light was at the height a person's hand would be if they were carrying a lantern at about hip level. I could see the shape of the lantern clearly. It was a traditional lantern, with a glass globe and a small flame inside. The kind of lantern that no one used anymore. The kind you might have seen in an old photograph of a 19th century fisherman. I could see the shape of the metal frame around the glass, and the small dark line of the wick inside it, and the warm yellow flicker of the flame. There was no one holding it. I want to be as precise as I can about this. The lantern was at a height, relative to the ground, that would have required a person of normal size to be holding it, above and below. The lantern, there was no human shape. There was no arm extending from the lantern. There was no body next to it. There was no shadow of a person on the ground around it. The lantern was moving by itself, at the pace of a man walking through the gathering dusk on the far bank. It was moving upstream, against the current. I watched it for maybe 5 seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I thought, for a moment, that there must be a person there, and I was somehow not able to see them in the sea. Low light. I squinted. I focused. The lantern glow was bright enough to illuminate a small circle of bank around it, and I could see the weeds and the small stones and the edge of the water in the yellow light. There was no person in that circle of light. The lantern was alone. It moved upstream at a steady pace. It did not flicker the way a lantern carried by a walking person flickers. It moved evenly, at a constant height, at a constant pace, as if it were being carried by someone whose stride was metronomic and whose hand was perfectly steady. Carl, without taking his eyes off the light, said, very quietly, "Let's go." I was going to ask him. I was going to say something like, "Do you see that?" Or, "What the hell is that?" Something normal, something that would have broken the odd quality of the braying moment. But Carl's voice had an edge in it that I had never heard from him before, and the way he said, "Let's go," was not a suggestion, it was an instruction, and I had known him long, enough to do what he said without argument. We waded back to the near bank. We did not run. We walked steadily through the water, keeping our footing on the slick stones, Carl in front and me behind. We reached the bank. Carl began packing his tackle with quick, efficient movements, the way a man does who has done the same thing many times before. I started doing the same. Neither of us spoke. I glanced across the river one more time before I turned to start hiking up the path. The lantern was still moving upstream on the far bank. It had not stopped. It had not turned to look at us. It was moving at the same steady pace, the same steady height, moving further and further up the river toward the head of the valley. The yellow glow of it got smaller as it went, but it did not go out. Carl followed my gaze. He grabbed my elbow. He did not shake it or pull it hard. He just took hold of me firmly, and he said, "Don't look at it. Come on, right now." We hiked up the path. The path was steep and rocky, and in the fading light it took all of our attention to place our feet. Carl went first with his headlamp, which he had clicked on the moment we got to the top of the bank. I followed him. Neither of us spoke during the hike. When we got to the top, to the small flat area where his truck was parked, Carl stowed his rod in the bed of the truck and got in the driver's seat without a word. I got in the passenger side. He started the engine. He backed the truck out onto the gravel road and began the slow drive down the ridge. We were 5 minutes into the drive before he spoke. He said, without looking at me, "You saw the lantern?" "Yes." "You saw that there was nobody carrying it?" "Yes." He nodded. He drove in silence for another minute. Then he said, "We'll talk at the house." "Not here. Just wait." I did not press him. I had known Carl long enough to know that when he said we would talk, later he meant it, and that nothing I said in the truck was going to speed up the conversation. We drove the rest of the way down the mountain in silence. The gravel road gave way to paved road. We passed a small country store with its lights still on. We turned onto the 2-lane highway that led back to his house. We got there a little after 10 at night. His wife Mary was already in bed. Carl went into the kitchen and pulled out 2 bottles of beer from the refrigerator, and he handed me one, and he sat down at the kitchen table. I sat down across from him. He took a long drink of his beer. He set it down. He looked at his hands. He said, "My grandfather taught me about the lanterns when I was a boy. He took me fishing. On that same river when I was 12, we saw one. On the far bank. It was moving upriver. Same as tonight. Same height, same pace. He grabbed me by the shoulder, same as I grabbed your elbow. He walked me out of there. He drove me home. He sat me down in his kitchen at the table in the house where I now live, and he told me." Carl took another long drink. I waited. He said the lanterns have been on that river for longer than our town has existed. His grandfather knew about them. His grandfather's grandfather knew about them. There have always been lanterns on the river in the evenings. Not every evening, sometimes, on summer nights especially. Nobody in his family ever saw anyone carrying them. Nobody ever will. My grandfather said the old people told him they were fishermen who had drowned in the river, and that they were still walking the banks they used to walk, carrying the lanterns they had been carrying when they went into the water. The lanterns had sunk with them. Whatever they had been doing when they drowned, they were still doing it, still walking upstream to their favorite pools, still holding their lanterns up to see the water. My grandfather said some of them have been walking those banks for 150 years, maybe more. He said the rule is very simple. You don't follow them. You don't try to figure out who they are. You don't call out to them. You do not ever, under any circumstances, answer them if they call out to you. I asked, "Do they call out?" Carl looked at me. He had not touched his beer for a minute. His hand was flat on the kitchen table. He said, "My grandfather said yes. He said sometimes you will hear a man's voice calling from across the river, from where the lantern is. A voice you might recognize." He said his cousin heard his own brother's voice calling him from across the river one summer night when they were fishing together. His brother was in the water next to him at the time. His brother heard it too, heard his own voice calling himself from across the river in the dark, asking him to come over. He said his cousin shook him back to himself before he could answer. They walked out of the river without another word. They never fished that spot again. He paused. He finished his beer in one long pull. He said, "I didn't want to tell you all of this tonight. I was going to drive you home and tell you we would talk about it in the morning. But you saw it. You saw the lantern. You watched it for a while. And if I didn't tell you now, you would spend the night thinking about it, and I don't want you to spend the night thinking about it without knowing the rule. The rule is this: you do not follow them upriver. You do not call out to them. You do not answer them if they call out to you. If you hear your own voice on the far bank, or your wife's voice, or your child's voice, especially your child's voice, you do not answer. You get out of the water. You walk away. You drive home. You do not go back to that river ever again, if you can help it." I sat with that for a while. My beer was warming in my hand. I asked him, "Have you ever heard a voice?" Carl shook his head. "No. I have seen lanterns 3 times in my life. Tonight is the 3rd. The first was with my grandfather when I was 12. The second was when I was 26. The week after I got back from college. I was fishing alone that time. I packed up and left the same way we left tonight. I have never heard a voice. My grandfather heard one once when he was in his 40s. He heard his own father's voice, who had been dead 10 years. His father's voice called him from across the river. He said it was the most loving voice he had ever heard. He said he wanted to answer more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. He said he walked out of the water without answering, and that he cried the whole drive home. I did not ask him any more questions that night. We sat at the kitchen table and we finished our beers, and after a while Carl got up and went to bed, and I sat alone in his kitchen for another hour looking at my empty bottle, and eventually I went up to the guest bedroom and I did not sleep much. In the morning we did not talk about it. We ate breakfast, we drank coffee. Mary asked us how the fishing had been, and Carl said, slow, which was the only thing he said about it to her. I drove home to Nashville that afternoon. I have been back to visit Carl many times in the years since. He has taken me fishing many times. He has never taken me back to that river. I have not asked him to. Carl's grandfather passed long before I ever met Carl. Carl himself is 63 now. He is still in good health, though he has slowed down some, and he does not drive up to the remote places anymore. I think about the lanterns more than I ever thought I would when I was a younger man. I think mostly about what Carl's grandfather said about hearing his own father's voice. I think about how the voice was loving and how he wanted to answer more than he had ever wanted anything, and how he walked out of the water without answering, and how he cried on the drive home. I think about what it would be like to stand in a river in the dusk and hear a voice you love calling your name from the far bank, in the warm yellow light of a lantern that nobody is holding, and to know that if you answer, you will become a light that walks upstream forever, on a bank you used to fish, with no one to carry you. I think about it mostly on summer evenings, when I am alone in my house in Nashville and the light is going out of the sky, and I am grateful, in a way I cannot explain, that when I stood in that river in Tennessee that evening and watched that yellow light moving on the far bank, I did not yet know to be afraid of what I was seeing, because if I had known, I am not sure I would have been able to look away. And I am grateful that Carl did know, and that he grabbed my elbow, and that he told me only what I needed to know when I needed to know it, and no more, the way his grandfather had done for him. My grandmother grew up in a small town in rural North Carolina, in the western part of the state where the land begins to rise into the foothills of the Blue Ridge. And when I was a small boy, she used to tell me stories about the place. She had moved away as a young woman after she married my grandfather, and they had settled in Charlotte where my mother and my aunt were raised. But she had gone back to her hometown 2 or 3 times a year until she got too old to travel, and she had always kept a relationship to the place that I, as a city boy growing up in the suburbs of Charlotte, found a little bit exotic. She told me about her girlhood. She told me about her parents, who had both died before I was born. She told me about the tobacco farms and the old church and the one-room schoolhouse she had attended until the 8th grade. And she told me every summer when my parents let me stay at her house for a week about the hitchhiker at Bryant's Crossing. She told me the story for the first time when I was about 7. She told it to me on a summer evening on the back porch of her house, while we sat in the 2 rocking chairs that she and my grandfather had bought when they first got married, and she rocked slowly and looked out at the small backyard where fireflies were coming up over the grass. She said that there was a place outside her hometown where 2 country roads crossed each other in the middle of nowhere. One road came down out of the foothills from the west, and the other ran north and south, connecting 2 small farming communities. The crossing was called Bryant's Crossing, after a family who had owned land there in the 1800s. She said that there was a stop sign at the crossing and a small patch of gravel at one corner, where cars sometimes pulled over, and that on certain summer nights, if you stopped at the crossing, there might be a young man standing there. She said he was always young. She said he looked to be about 18 or 19. She said he was always wearing old clothes that looked to her, even when she had been a young woman herself, as if they were from a generation or two earlier. A brown corduroy jacket, a plain white shirt, dark trousers, old leather shoes. His hair was combed to the side the way boys had worn their hair in the 1930s and 40s. He was always clean. He was always polite. He never seemed drunk or sick or in any kind of obvious trouble. He was simply a young man standing at a crossroads on a summer night, waiting for someone to give him a ride. She said that if you stopped, he would ask you, in a quiet voice, if you could take him to a farmhouse a few miles up the road to the north. He would describe the house. He would tell you it was his family's place. He would thank you for stopping. If you agreed to take him, he would get in the passenger seat, and he would give you directions, politely, mile by mile. He would not say much. He would not ask about you. He would only direct you until you turned off the county road onto a narrow dirt lane that led up a small rise to an old white farmhouse, set back in a stand of oaks. She said that when you pulled up to the farmhouse, it would always be dark, no lights on, no sound of people, no cars in the yard. He would say thank you one more time, very gently. He would get out of the car. He would walk up the path that led to the front porch. And before he reached the porch, before he could knock on the door, he would be gone. My grandmother told this story in a matter-of-fact way. She did not try to scare me with it. She said she had never stopped at that crossing herself, not at night, because her father had told her not to. But she had known people who had. Her older brother had picked up the young man once. In the 1940s, before he went off to the war, her brother had come home white-faced and had told their father what had happened, and their father had told him, quietly, that he was not the first Bryant to have given that young man a ride, and that the family had known about him for a long time. I laughed at the story when I was a child, not cruelly, but the way a child laughs at a story he does not quite believe. My grandmother did not argue with me about it. She just smiled a little and rocked in her chair and watched the fireflies and told me, well, maybe so, honey, maybe so. She told me the story 3 or 4 more times over the years of my childhood. Every time, the details were exactly the same. The brown corduroy jacket, the polite voice, the farmhouse up the road to the north, the darkness when you got there, the walk up the path, the vanishing before the door. I came to know the story by heart. By the time I was a teenager, I had stopped laughing at it, but I had also stopped taking it seriously. It was just one of my grandmother's stories, one of the things she knew about the country she had come from, a piece of family folklore that I thought of with affection but not belief. My grandmother was 81 years old the summer I was 22. I had just finished my junior year of college, and I was working a summer job at a state park in the western part of North Carolina, not far from her hometown. The job ran from the beginning of June to the middle of August. I lived in a small cabin at the park, and on the weekends, when I had the time, I drove the 40 minutes over to my grandmother's house and spent Saturday night and Sunday with her. My grandfather had been gone for 15 years by then. She was alone in the house. My mother worried about her. I was glad to be close enough to visit. It was the second weekend of August. I was driving back to the park on a Sunday evening, after a visit, and I had stayed later than I had meant to, and the sun was already going down. By the time I got on the road, I drove west, back up into the foothills. The route took me along a country highway I had driven many times that summer, and on that particular stretch, about 20 miles from the park, there was an intersection I had never paid much attention to. A stop sign, a small patch of gravel at one corner, 2 country roads crossing each other, in the middle of nowhere. I came up to it on that Sunday evening around 9. The sun had gone behind the ridge, and the road was in that deep blue dusk light that comes between sunset and full dark. I slowed for the stop sign. I glanced right, out of habit, to check for oncoming traffic on the crossing road. There was a young man standing at the corner. He was on the small patch of gravel at the edge of the crossing road. He was standing very still, with his hands at his sides, looking down the road in the direction I was coming from. I saw him clearly in my headlights as I slowed. He looked to be about 18 or 19. He was wearing a brown corduroy jacket and a white shirt and dark trousers and old leather shoes. His hair was combed carefully to one side in a way that no young man I knew in 1998 combed his hair. His face was pale and calm. He did not squint in my headlights. He did not turn away. He stood there and he watched my car come up to the stop sign. I stopped at the sign. I looked over at him. He looked at me. I rolled my window down. It was not a conscious decision. I had not thought, in the 10 seconds between seeing him and reaching the sign, about the story my grandmother had told me. The story was not in the front of my mind. The young man was simply a young man standing at a country crossroads at dusk, and it seemed like the decent thing to do to ask him if he needed help. I rolled the window down, and I leaned across the passenger seat, and I said, "You need a ride? Somewhere?" He took a step toward the car. He bent down slightly to see me through the open window. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and polite, the voice of a boy raised to be respectful to his elders. He said, "Yes, sir, if you wouldn't mind. I'm trying to get home. My family's place is a few miles up the road to the north. I'd be much obliged." I looked at him. He was standing at the open window. His face was close enough to mine that I could see the details of it. His skin was clean and young. His eyes were blue. He had a small mole on his jaw, near his ear. He smelled faintly of something I can only describe as outdoors, of wood smoke maybe, or of leaves. He did not smell like a modern young man would smell. There was no cologne, no deodorant, no chemical scent of any kind. I want to say that the story came back to me then. I want to say that I remembered what my grandmother had told me, and that I thought about whether I should do this. But the truth is that I did not think about any of that. Something in me had already decided. I said, "Sure, hop in." He walked around the front of the car and got in the passenger side. He closed the door quietly. He said, "Thank you, sir. I appreciate it." He folded his hands in his lap. I pulled away from the stop sign, turned onto the northbound road, and started driving. We did not talk much. He directed me, politely, in the way my grandmother had described. He said, "You'll want to stay on this road for a while." A mile later, he said, "There'll be a turn coming up on your left. It's an easy one to miss." I slowed, watching for it. A narrow dirt lane appeared between two pastures. I would have missed it if he had not warned me. I turned onto it. The dirt lane climbed gently up a small rise, through a stand of oak trees that arched over the road, and then opened out into a small yard in front of an old white farmhouse. The farmhouse was dark. I want to tell you exactly what it looked like. It was a 2-story white clapboard house, plainly built, the kind of modest farmhouse that had been put up by country people in the 1890s. It had a wide porch across the front, with 2 wooden posts holding up the roof. The windows were shuttered. The door was closed. There were no lights on inside. There were no cars in the yard. There was no sound of a dog, or of people, or of any kind of life. The house sat in its stand of oaks in the deep blue dusk, and it looked exactly like a house where nobody had been for a long time. I pulled up to the front walk. I stopped the car. The young man sat for a moment in the first passenger seat. Then he turned his head and he looked at me. His face was kind. He said, quietly, "I'm much obliged to you, sir. Thank you for the ride. It's a long walk otherwise." "You sure this is the place?" I said. My voice sounded strange to me. "Yes, sir. This is the place." He opened the door. He got out. He closed the door behind him, quietly, with the care of a young man who had been raised not to slam doors. He walked around the front of the car, crossed the small yard, and started up the path toward the porch. I watched him. He walked at a normal pace, in the unhurried gait of a young man going home after a long. The path from the yard to the porch was maybe 15 feet long, made of small flagstones set into the grass. He walked the first few feet of it. He walked past the small hedge at the edge of the yard. He came within 5 or 6 feet of the porch steps. He stopped being there. I want to be clear about this. He did not turn. He did not step off the path. He did not fade. slowly. Between one step and the next, in the deep blue dusk, in my full view, he simply was not there anymore. The path in front of me was empty. The porch was empty. The house stood dark and silent in its stand of oaks, and there was no one on the walk between me and it. I sat in my car for a long time. I do not know how long. The dashboard clock said 9:14 when I pulled into the yard. When I finally put the car in reverse and backed slowly down the dirt lane, it said 10:47. I had been sitting there for over an hour and a half, looking at the empty path, waiting, I think, for him to come back. He did not. The farmhouse stayed dark. The yard stayed empty. Nothing moved. I backed down the dirt lane to the county road. I turned south. I drove back past the crossing, which had no one standing at it now, and I drove the rest of the way to the park. I got into my cabin at almost midnight. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the small bed in the cabin, and I thought about what my grandmother had told me, and I thought about the brown corduroy jacket and the polite voice and the way the path had been empty when I looked at it. My grandmother passed away the next March, 8 months later. She died in her own bed, in the house where she had lived for 59 years. I sat with her in the last days. I held her hand. She was lucid, mostly, until the very end. She asked me, once, whether I had been happy with my summer job the previous year. I said I had. She asked whether I had driven much in the country roads near her hometown. I paused for a moment, and then I told her I had. I did not tell her the rest. I do not know why I did not tell her. I have thought about it many times since. I think, at the time, I was afraid she would be frightened for me, or that she would grieve for me in some way, or that she would want to know things I could not answer. I think I wanted her to go on, believing whatever it was she believed about the hitchhiker at Bryant's Crossing, without the burden of knowing that her own grandson had given him a ride. I think I was selfish. I think I was afraid. She died believing I did not believe her. She never knew that I had driven that young man up the road to a house that had been dark for longer than my grandmother had been alive. She never knew that I had watched him walk up the path and vanish, and that I had sat in my car in the yard for an hour and a half afterward, not quite able to move. I have thought often, in the 25 years since, about the farmhouse, about who had lived there and when, about who the young man had been, and what had happened to him, and why he kept asking for rides home on summer nights at a country crossroads in western North Carolina. I have driven past Bryant's Crossing a few times in my adult life, always. During the day, always at speed. I have never stopped. I have never gone back to that farmhouse. I do not know if it is still standing. What I know is that I have come to understand, too late, what my grandmother was really telling me with her stories. She was not telling me not to stop at the crossing. She was telling me, I think, that she knew I would. She was telling me that the young man was kind, and that he would be grateful, and that the ride was the thing he needed, and that if I gave it to him, he would thank me and walk up a path and disappear, and that would be the end of it. She was telling me, in the only way a grandmother can tell a small child such a thing, that it would be all right, that I would come home, that I would live. She was telling me that she had been driving that road all her life, and that her father had, and that her brother had, and that we are the kind of family that picks him up, and that the picking up is a small kindness, and that the kindness has to be paid forward. I never told her. She went to her grave thinking I had laughed at her stories. I live with that. I drive the back roads of North Carolina sometimes. Still, I do not stop for hitchhikers anymore. But I think, on certain summer evenings, about the young man in the brown corduroy jacket, and I wonder if he is still there, at Bryant's Crossing, waiting to be taken home. And I wonder, on the bad nights, whether I will see him again someday, in another place, at another crossroads, in clothes from some other era, and whether, when I do, I will have the sense to keep driving, or whether I will slow and roll down my window and ask him, in the way my grandmother must have known I always would, whether he needs a ride somewhere. My wife's family owned a cabin on a small private pond in the mountains of Western Virginia, and the first summer I went out there with her. The summer after we were married, I learned something about her family that changed, quietly and permanently, the way I understood the place. The cabin had been built by her grandfather in 1956. He had bought the property, which was about 40 acres of mixed pasture and woodlot surrounding a 5-acre pond, from the estate of a farmer who had died there 2 years earlier. The grandfather had been a doctor in Richmond with a love of the mountains and a large enough family that he had wanted a place where his children and their eventual families could gather. He had built the cabin himself over 3 summers, with the help of his grown sons, and he had finished it in time for the first full family reunion in the summer of 1959. The cabin had been the site of those reunions every summer since. By the time I attended my first one, in July of the year I turned 29. The tradition was 42 years old, and my wife's family had grown to include 3 generations of cousins and in-laws, roughly 40 people in total, who gathered for a week every year to swim in the pond and cook meals together and sleep in the cabin and in the 2 smaller guest houses her uncle had built on the property in the 1980s. I had met my wife's family plenty of times before the reunion. I had been to her parents' house for holidays. I had met 2 of her uncles and most of her cousins at our wedding the year before. But the reunion was something different. The reunion was the event at which you were fully absorbed into the family, and my wife had been quietly coaching me for months about the rhythms of the week. Her father, who I knew only slightly then, was going to pick me up at the gate with the 4-wheeler and drive me up to the cabin, she had said. Her mother was going to hug me and cry a little. Her younger cousins were going to be shy for an hour and then would not leave me alone for the rest of the week. There would be a fish fry on Wednesday night. There would be a bonfire on Friday. I should be prepared to be teased. I should bring my own bug spray. My father-in-law, Doyle, met me at the gate exactly as my wife had described. He was in his early 60s that year, a quiet, solid man with gray hair and the weathered hands of someone who had done physical work all his life. He worked as a civil engineer, but he had grown up on a farm, and his whole manner still carried the slow, patient quality of a man who had been raised to work with his hands. He drove me up the long dirt lane to the cabin in the 4-wheeler, my bags rattling in the small cargo bed behind us, and he asked me how the drive up had been and told me where my wife was and pointed out, as we came over the last rise, the full view of the cabin and the pond below. The pond was beautiful. It was roughly oval, set in a shallow bowl of pasture that sloped down from the cabin to the water on the near side and back up to a small woodlot on the far side. The cabin sat on the high ground above the near bank, a long log structure with a wide, screened porch facing the water. There was a small floating dock at the end of a wooden walkway and 2 rowboats tied up to it. The pond surface was dark and still in the late afternoon sun. A few ducks were paddling near the far bank. It was exactly the kind of place I had imagined when my wife had described her childhood summers, and I remember thinking, as Doyle pulled up behind the cabin, that I was very lucky to be marrying into a family that had a place like this. Doyle did not get out of the 4-wheeler right away. He killed the engine. He sat for a moment, looking out at the water. Then he said, in the same conversational tone he had been using the whole drive up, "Before you get out and everybody swarms you, there's one thing I want to tell you." I turned toward him. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes on the pond. He said, "Sometimes, in the evenings, when the light is getting low, you might see an old man standing in the water at the far side of the pond. He's knee-deep. He stands there facing the cabin. If you look at him, he doesn't look back at you. He looks past you, toward the cabin. He doesn't move. He's there for about half an hour usually, and then he isn't. If you see him, I want you to do me a favor and just don't mention it. Not to the children, not to the other in-laws, not to anybody who hasn't brought him up to you first. If you need to talk about it, you come find me, and we'll talk about it privately." all right? I looked at him. He was still looking at the water. His face was calm and matter-of-fact. Okay, I said. I did not know what else to say. He's been there a long time, Doyle said. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't come to the cabin. He doesn't respond if you wave or call out, which we have all learned not to do. He just watches. It upsets some people to see him. I don't want the kids to know, that's all. All right. Doyle turned and looked at me then. His eyes were a clear, pale gray, and they were kind. And they were the eyes of a man who had delivered this same orientation to several previous in-laws and was used to the slightly stunned response. "Welcome to the family," he said. He patted my shoulder. He got out of the four-wheeler. I did not see the old man on my first evening. I did not see him on my second. The week got going. I was absorbed into the family the way my wife had predicted. I met cousins I had not met before. I helped her mother set up long tables on the screened porch for a big pasta dinner on Monday night. I went swimming on Tuesday afternoon with the younger cousins, who were, as predicted, shy for an hour and impossible to escape for the rest of the week. I paddled a rowboat with my wife around the perimeter of the pond on Tuesday evening, staying well away from the far bank, although neither of us spoke about that. She had been raised on this pond. She knew the rule about the old man the way I knew the rule about not whistling indoors in my grandmother's house. It was something you did not need to discuss. You just did it. On my third evening, Wednesday, I saw him. It was just after the Wednesday night fish fry. The fish fry was a major event of the reunion, a meal of fried catfish and hush puppies and coleslaw that Doyle and his brother prepared. Outside on a big propane burner they set up in the yard. The whole family ate at the long tables on the porch as the sun went down. By the time dinner was finished and people were beginning to drift away from the tables to find dessert in the kitchen, the light had gone thin and blue. It was the hour just before full dark. I carried a stack of plates from the porch toward the kitchen, pausing for a moment at the porch screen to look out over the pond. The water was completely still. A light mist was beginning to form above its surface, the way mist sometimes forms on small mountain ponds. In summer, when the evening cools, the far bank was in shadow, the woods behind it a dark wall against the fading sky. There was a man standing in the water at the far side of the pond. He was knee-deep. The water around his legs was still, not disturbed by any movement. He was tall, and he was thin, and he was wearing what looked to me, even at that distance and in that light, like dark work clothes, the kind of plain button-up shirt and trousers a farmer of an older generation might have worn. His shirt was a dark color, maybe navy or black. His trousers were the same. He was wearing heavy boots, or something that looked like boots, though they were under the water. His hair was gray and thin. His face was turned toward me, toward the cabin, really. He was facing the cabin. His face was in deep shadow because of the angle of the remaining light, and I could not see his features clearly, but I could see the pale oval of his face tilted up toward the porch where I was standing. He was perfectly still. I did not call out. I did not point. I remembered Doyle's quiet words from the gate, and I did not mention him to anyone. I stood at the porch screen with the stack of plates in my hands, and I looked at him for a long moment. I watched to see if he would move. I watched to see if he would turn his head. He did not. He stood in the water, still and patient, looking up at the cabin, and the light slowly failed around him, and the mist slowly thickened on the pond, and after a while I could no longer clearly see him, although I could still make out something dark, standing in the water where he had been. I brought the plates to the kitchen. I helped my wife's aunt load the dishwasher. I was quiet for the rest of the evening, though nobody seemed to notice, because the evening was loud, with children and adults, and the satisfaction of a large family dinner well eaten. I slept badly. That night, in the small guest bedroom my wife and I had been given, my wife was already asleep when I came to bed. I lay next to her, and I looked at the ceiling in the dark, and I thought about the old man in the water. In the morning, early, before most of the family was up, I found Doyle on the back porch with a cup of coffee. He was sitting in one of the rocking chairs, looking out at the mist rising off the pond in the first light. I poured myself a cup and went and sat down next to him. For a while, we did not say anything. The ordinary morning sounds of the woods and the pond were the only sound. Finally, I said, "I saw him last night." Doyle nodded slowly. He did not turn his head. He just rocked gently in his chair. "At the fish fry?" "Right after." "From the porch." "I was clearing plates." He nodded again. He sipped his coffee. He said, "I saw him my first summer too, the year I started dating my wife. I was 24. Her father took me aside at the gate the same way I did with you. He told me what I told you. I saw the old man on my second evening, standing in exactly the same place. He was wearing the same clothes. He was facing the cabin. His face was in shadow. He did not move. I asked him who the old man was. Doyle drank his coffee for a moment. Then he said his name was Henry Crenshaw, or it was when he was alive. He was the farmer who used to own this land before my father bought it. He lived in a small house just up the hill there, where the woodlot is now. He had lived on this land his whole life. His father had lived on it. His grandfather had lived on it. The family had been here since the early 1800s, back when there was no road and no survey. They were the first white settlers in this particular hollow, as far as anyone knew. Henry was the last of them. He never married, never had children. He lived alone with his dogs and his cows and his chickens. And he got old, and the land got harder to work, and he fell into the pond one evening in the late summer of 1954, and he drowned in it. He was 78. The coroner said he had a stroke while he was out walking his property, and that he fell into the water and was not strong enough to get up. My father bought the land from his estate in 1955 because there was no family left to inherit it. My father did not know about Henry when he bought it. He learned about him the first summer after he built the cabin. He came out here alone in the evening to check the water level, and he saw Henry standing on the far bank, knee-deep, facing the cabin. Henry had only been gone 4 years. By then, my father recognized him from an old photograph that had come with the paperwork on the property. I sat with that for a while. I asked, "Why is he still here?" Doyle shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I don't think he knows. My father used to say that. He didn't believe in ghosts, but that he believed in people who didn't want to leave a place they had lived on their whole lives, and that sometimes, if you tried hard enough at something, maybe some little piece of you could stay. He thought Henry just had not been able to give up the land. He had been the last of his family. There was nobody to pass it to. He had lived and died here, and when my father bought the place, Henry came back out, I think, to see what was going to happen. And I think he has been watching ever since, to see what we are doing with it. He has never done anything. He does not interfere. He does not come close. He does not frighten the cattle or the deer. He just stands in the water in the evenings, and he watches the cabin. Sometimes he watches for a month. Sometimes nobody sees him for a year. My father saw him maybe 20 times in all the years before he died. I have seen him, I don't know, 30 or 40 times in my life. My brothers have seen him. My wife has seen him. Her mother saw him. The kids don't know about him because we decided years ago that it was better for them not to know. When they are old enough, we tell them, or their husbands or wives, before they come up here the first time. Doyle paused. He said, "He has never hurt anyone. In all the years, in all the reunions, we have had 42 of them. He has watched us do every single one of them. He has watched my wife and her brothers grow up and marry and have children and then have grandchildren. He has watched all of us, and he has never stepped out of the water, and he has never come up the bank, and he has never reached toward the cabin. He just stands there and he watches, and then he goes." I asked him, "Is it sad to you?" Doyle thought about that. He said, "Yes, it is sad to me. He was a man who loved his land. He had no one to pass it to. He couldn't let go of it. I don't know if he knows we bought it. I don't know if he understands that we are a different family, living in a different cabin, running the property in a different. I don't know if he is confused or if he is lonely, or if he simply cannot stop doing what he did in life, which was to walk this land every evening and look at it. I feel for him. I don't know what to do for him. I have tried a couple of times over the years to leave things out for. My father left an old photograph on a post at the edge of the water one summer, a void, picture of Henry's family, thinking it might comfort him. It did not seem to make any difference. I have had a priest up here once, from our church in Richmond. He walked the pond, and he said prayers over the water. It did not seem to make any difference. Henry has kept watching. We rocked in the chairs. The mist was lifting off the pond as the sun rose higher. Doyle said, "The only thing I have learned to do is let him watch. I treat him like a neighbor, a quiet neighbor who doesn't come over. I don't wave at him, because we tried that once and he didn't respond, and it felt wrong. But I think of him as sharing the property with us. I think he has more right to be here than we do, when it comes down to it." I sat with him for a while longer. The sun came up. The family began to stir inside the cabin. I went to help with breakfast. That was 23 years ago. My wife and I have been to the reunion every summer since. Our own kids are teenagers now. They know about Henry. We told them when they were old enough. They have seen him too, both of them, at different ages, and they know the rule. You do not call out. You do not point. You do not tell the smaller children. You let him watch. Doyle passed away 4 years ago. He was 79. He had a stroke in his own kitchen in Richmond and did not survive it. We buried him, and the next summer we went back to the cabin for the reunion. And on the second evening of that week, at dusk, I was standing on the porch alone with a cup of coffee, and I looked out at the far bank, and I saw Henry standing in the water in his dark clothes. And I saw, a few feet beside him, in the shallow water, the shape of another man, a shorter man, solid and broad-shouldered, standing just as still, standing just as patient, watching the cabin. I could not see his face clearly in the dusk, but I knew, in the way you know things that you do not want to know, that it was Doyle, that he had come back, the way Henry had come back, because he had loved this place, and he did not want to leave it either. I did not call out, I did not point. I finished my coffee. I went inside. That was 4 years ago. I have seen Doyle twice more since then, standing beside Henry, knee-deep in the water, at the far side of the pond, watching the cabin. I have not told my wife. I have not told my children. I have not told my mother-in-law, who still comes to the Coffee Gardner reunion every year, and who sits on the porch in the evenings in the same rocking chair Doyle used to sit in, looking out at the water. She is 84. She has been a good woman to him. I do not want her to know that he did not fully leave. I think about Henry. I think about Doyle. I think about what it means to love a place so much that you cannot let go of it, even when you know you should. I think about what the pond does to people, and I think, sometimes, about my own daughter, who is the family historian, already at 17, who is the one who will probably inherit the cabin when my wife's mother is gone, and who will run the reunions into the next generation. And I wonder, on the bad nights, whether 40 years from now, some new son-in-law, freshly absorbed into the family, will stand on the porch at dusk and will see, in the water at the far side of the pond, not 2 figures, but 3. And I wonder whether my daughter, as she grows into her place as the keeper of the cabin, will take him aside at the gate, the way Doyle took me, and will tell him gently and matter-of-factly about the men who stand in the water and watch, and will not quite be able to say, without her voice breaking, that one of them is her father. When I was 12, my parents sent me to spend a summer on my great-aunt's farm in southwestern Virginia, a stretch of land about 40 miles outside of Galax that had been in my father's family since before the Civil War. I was an only child, and my mother had just started a new job that was going to keep her out of the house, long hours through June and July, and my father, who worked long hours already, had suggested that I spend the summer in the country with his aunt instead of being alone in our house in Richmond. I protested. I did not want to spend a summer in the middle of nowhere with an 80-year-old woman I had met maybe 4 times in my life. My protests did not matter. The plan was made. In early June of the summer I was 12, my father drove me the 5 hours from Richmond to Aunt Bertie's farm, and he left me there with a duffel bag and a promise to come back for me at the end of July. Aunt Bertie was my paternal grandmother's older sister. She had been widowed for almost 30 years by the time I stayed with her, and she had run the farm alone in all of that time, with only occasional help from a neighbor who leased her pastures for his cattle. She was small and thin and wiry, with white hair pinned up in a loose knot on top of her head and a voice that was soft but carried. She had a strong accent that my father had lost when he went away to college, the old mountain cadence of southwestern Virginia, and when she talked to me, she used words that I had only ever heard in her letters. She was kind to me in a plain matter-of-fact way. She made me 3 meals a day. She gave me chores that she said a boy my age ought to be able to do. She told me where I could go on the farm and where I could not, and she told me this on my first evening, standing with me on the back porch as the sun went down over the ridge behind the house. She told me I could go anywhere in the front pasture, which was the big field in front of the house. I could walk down to the creek at the bottom of the property, as long as I was careful of snakes. I could go into the barn during the day, though I was not to climb up into the loft, because the ladder was old. I could walk the road down to the mailbox, which was a quarter-mile away, as often as I liked. She said I was a smart boy, and she trusted me. Then she pointed at the small cornfield that ran along the back of the house, between the house and the tree line where the woods started. "That's my cornfield," she said. "Stay out of it in the evenings. After supper, you don't go in. There. You don't walk around the edge of it. You don't go down the rows. You keep clear. If you want to go to the woods for something, you go around it, not through it, all right?" "Yes, ma'am." She did not explain why. She did not say anything more about it. She went back inside to start on supper, and I stood on the back porch for a minute, looking at the cornfield. The corn, that summer, was already about 4 feet high, tall enough that you could not see down the rows unless you were looking straight into them. The field was maybe half an acre, square, with neat rows running north to south. Beyond it, the woods rose up in a dark line. It was a cornfield. It was not, to a city boy in June, a remarkable thing. I did not question the rule. I was 12 years old, and Aunt Bertie was an old woman in a part of the country I did not know well, and it seemed to me, at the time, like the kind of country rule that old women had for reasons of their own, the way my grandmother had a rule about never whistling after dark in the house. I accepted it for the first 6 weeks of my stay. I did not go into the cornfield in the evenings. During the day, I walked past the edge of it a few times on my way to the woods behind the farm, but in the evenings I stayed in the front pasture or on the porch or in the house. I kept the rule without thinking about it. It was a hot summer. Toward the end of July, the heat settled in hard. The afternoons were humid and heavy, and the evenings stayed warm long after dark. Aunt Bertie did not have air conditioning. The house had a box fan in the kitchen window and another in her bedroom, and at night you slept with the windows open and the fans running, and the air that came through was hot air being pushed around. On the hot nights, I sometimes sat on the back porch after supper, in an old rocking chair, trying to catch whatever small breeze might come down off the ridge before I had to go up to bed in the sweltering upstairs room. One night near the end of July, it was especially hot. The air had that heavy stillness that comes before a summer thunderstorm, but with no storm actually coming. Aunt Bertie had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. I sat on the back porch in the rocking chair, with a glass of ice water, watching the fireflies come up in the cornfield and over the front pasture. The sun had gone down an hour before. The sky over the ridge was a deep blue, going toward full dark. I heard children laughing. The sound was coming from the direction of the cornfield. It was faint at first, and I thought, in the way you do when you hear something unexpected at dusk, that I must be mistaken. I stopped rocking. I listened. It was laughter. It was children. It was not one child. It was several, at least 3, maybe 4. The voices were young, the high, bright laughter of children playing some game. Together, I heard a girl's voice shout something indistinct, and then laughter in response. I heard a boy's voice call out a word, and then more laughter. The sound was coming from the cornfield, from somewhere deep in the rows, maybe in the middle of the field, maybe a little beyond it. I sat for a moment. I was 12. I had not had another child to play with all summer. The sound of other children laughing on a hot July night, in a part of the country where I did not know anyone, was the sound of something I had been missing for 6 weeks. I got up out of the rocking chair. I walked down off the porch, across the small patch of grass that ran between the house and the cornfield, and I stopped at the edge of the corn. The laughing was still going on. It was maybe 30 feet into the field, I thought, or a little further. I could hear the children clearly, a girl laughing in a sudden burst, a boy saying, "You got me," and the other voices calling out in mock protest. It sounded like a game of tag or something like it. The corn was moving slightly, here and there down the rows, the way corn moves when children are running through it. I called out. I said, "Hey, who's out there?" The laughing stopped. It did not taper. It did not fade. It stopped all at once, the way laughing stops when children hear a grown-up's voice and are not sure whether they are in trouble. There was a moment of complete silence in the cornfield. The corn stopped moving. The fireflies kept coming up around me. The crickets kept chirping, but the children were silent. Then a single voice, a small girl's voice, came from somewhere very close to the edge of the corn, close enough that I almost took a step back. The voice was soft and sweet. It said, "Do you want to play?" I did not answer. I want to say that I remembered Aunt Bertie's rule, and that was why I did not answer. But the truth is more complicated than that. I did not answer because something in the voice was wrong. It was a child's voice, and it was asking a child's question, and the words were perfectly polite and ordinary. But the voice had too much patience in it. It sounded like a voice that had asked that question before, many times, and that was used to waiting for an answer. It did not sound like a child who had just been interrupted in her game. It sounded like a child who had been standing at the edge of the corn, waiting for me for much longer than the laughing had been going on. I did not answer. I took one step back, then another. Then I turned and I walked back across the grass to the porch. I did not run. Something in me understood, without my thinking about it, that running would be a mistake. I walked at a steady pace. I went up the porch steps. I reached for the back door. The back door opened before I touched it. Aunt Bertie was standing there in her nightgown and a thin cotton robe. Her white hair was loose around her shoulders. Her face, which had been small and pleasant in the evening, light of the kitchen an hour earlier, was now gray. Not the gray of dim light, the actual gray of a face that has had the blood drained out of it. Her eyes were very wide. She had heard me call out. She reached out, grabbed my arm, and pulled me inside. She closed the door behind me and turned the deadbolt. She turned the small latch above, the deadbolt that I had never seen her use. She pulled me through the kitchen and into the sitting room, where she sat me down on the old horsehair sofa, and she stood over me, and she said, in a voice that was tight and quiet, "What did you do, child? What did you do?" "I heard kids," I said. "I heard kids laughing in the cornfield." "And what did you do?" "I walked to the edge. I called out. I asked who was out there. And then a little girl asked me if I wanted to play." Aunt Bertie closed her eyes. She held onto the back of the chair in front of her. She stood, like that for a moment, with her eyes closed, and she did not speak. Then she opened her eyes, and she looked at me, and she said, "Did you answer her?" "No, ma'am." She let out a long, slow breath. She sat down in the chair. She looked at her hands in her lap. She said, "You stay in this house tonight. You do not go out on that porch. You do not go out that back door for any reason. You need to pee. You use that bucket in the back room. I will set it out for you. You do not go out into the yard tonight. You do not go near a window that faces the back. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am, I understand. She got up. She walked me upstairs to my bedroom. She made me sit on the bed while she closed and locked the window, even though the house was hot. She pulled the curtains shut. She checked under the bed, which I did not understand at the time, but which I have thought about many times since. She stood at the door and looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "Do not open that window tonight. Not for air, not for anything. Do not look out of it. If you hear anything outside, you do not look." I nodded. She closed the door. I heard her footsteps go back down the stairs. I heard her moving around in the kitchen, locking things. I heard her check the front door. I heard her check the windows on the first floor. I heard her drag a chair across the kitchen floor, I think to put against the back door. Then I heard her go into her own room and close her door. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed, in my clothes, and I sweated, and I listened. I heard the laughing a few more times over the course of the night. It was faint. It was muffled by the walls of the house and by the distance from the cornfield. I heard it once, more clearly, very late, and I thought for a terrible moment that it was coming from somewhere closer than the field. Maybe the yard, maybe the porch. I pulled the sheet up over my head like a child even younger than I was, and I lay there, and I did not look at the window. At some point, near morning, I slept. I did not dream. In the morning, Aunt Bertie was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She had coffee made. She had a plate of eggs and bacon and biscuits ready for me. She looked tired, but the gray had gone out of her face. She set the plate in front of me. She sat down, across from me with her own cup of coffee. She said, "I'll tell you about the children now. You earned the telling by doing the right thing." I ate. I listened. She told me that the children had been heard in that cornfield for as long as anyone in our family could remember. Her grandmother had heard them when she was a girl in the 1870s. Her grandmother had told her when she was a girl in the 1920s that the laughter had already been old then, that her own grandmother had told her about it going back into some time before the family had records. The children had always been in the cornfield in the evenings, always laughing, always playing. Nobody knew who they were. Nobody had ever seen them. The only people who had ever reported seeing anything were the 2 or 3 and 4 generations who had answered when the children asked them to play, and those people had not come back out of the field. Her grandmother had had a younger brother who had answered once on a July night in 1881. He had been 9 years old. His mother had heard him call out that he was going to play from the backyard, and she had come running out, and when she reached the edge of the cornfield, the laughing had stopped, and her boy had been gone. They had searched the field for 3 days. They had torn up the corn looking for him. They had found nothing. He had not left footprints. He had not left anything. He had simply gone into the corn, and he had not come out. Her grandmother had never been the same. Her grandmother had told Aunt Bertie, when Aunt Bertie was a small girl, that she thought her little brother was still in there, somewhere, still playing, still laughing, and that if you answered the children when they asked, you joined them, and you did not come back. Aunt Bertie told me the rule was never, under any circumstances, to answer the invitation. She told me her own older sister had heard the children as a girl in 1915 and had almost answered, and their mother had grabbed her by the arm and had dragged her into the house and had told her the rule. Aunt Bertie's mother had told her, Aunt Bertie had told her own children when they were small, the son and the daughter who lived in Ohio now and rarely came back. Aunt Bertie had told me. She said, "I should have told you when you got here. I'm sorry I didn't. I thought you were a city boy and wouldn't wander. I thought you'd keep the rule without hearing the whole of it. I was wrong. I will apologize to your mama for not telling you. It was my job to keep you safe, on my land, and I almost didn't. But you did right, child. You did right. You did not answer. That is the only thing that matters. You did not answer." I finished my breakfast. I did not say much. I helped Aunt Bertie with the dishes. Then I went out to the front porch, and I sat in the rocking chair and I looked out over the front pasture, which was in full sunlight and ordinary, and I felt, for the first time since the night before, that I might be able to breathe normally again. I spent the last 4 days of my stay on the farm without going near the cornfield, even during the day. When my father came to pick me up, Aunt Bertie hugged him and pressed a small, covered dish of biscuits into his hands and asked him, quietly, to talk to me about the farm. When we got back to Richmond, she did not tell him what had happened. She left it to me to tell him if I wanted to. I never told my father. I have never told anyone. Aunt Bertie passed in 1998, when I was 19. My father inherited the farm. He leased the pastures to the same neighbor and did not keep up the house, and eventually, when he was old, he sold the property to that neighbor, who was a decent man and a hard worker, and who, my father told me, had ripped out the cornfield in the first summer. He owned the place and put the land back into pasture. I do not know if that ended it. I suspect it did not. I suspect the children were in that land before it was ever a cornfield, and that they are there still, in whatever way they have always been there, and that some summer night, some boy in the house that used to be my great aunt's will hear them laughing in the back pasture where the corn used to grow, and he will walk out to the edge, and he will call out, and a small girl's voice will ask him if he wants to play. I hope whoever owns that land, when that happens, has been told the rule. I hope they have passed it down the way my great aunt passed it to me. I hope they have been kinder about it than she was, that they told the children in their charge early, and not only after the children had been tested. I do not go back to that part of Virginia anymore. I have not been back since my father sold the farm. I have told my own daughter, who is 10 years old now, a version of the story. I told her that some summer night she might hear other children laughing from somewhere she cannot see. I told her she is not to answer. I did not tell her why. She looked at me strangely, the way children do when they understand that their parent is telling them something true and strange at the same time. I think she will remember. I hope she does. I was driving back from a wedding one August night, through the back roads of eastern Kentucky, and the whole long drive through that country is what I remember more than the wedding itself. The wedding had been my cousin's, held at a small reception hall outside Pikeville. I was 31 that summer, unmarried, working as a middle school teacher in Lexington. I had stayed later than I should have, caught up talking to an uncle I had not seen in 15 years, and by the time I got on the road it was past 11, and the wedding was 4 hours from my apartment. An aunt had told me the back way was scenic and would save me 20 minutes. At 11:30 at night, I was no longer interested in scenic, but I was already on the back route, and I was too tired to second guess. The hills pressed in close. The road wound along the bottom of one narrow valley, climbed a low pass, dropped into another. There were almost no houses, almost no other cars. Once, around midnight, a deer stepped onto the shoulder, looked at me, and walked back into the brush. I had been driving maybe 2 hours on the back route, somewhere I had stopped trying to match the road to the map. I was tired. I was hungry. I was starting to think seriously about pulling over at the next lit building I saw, just to stretch my legs. The road climbed into a small pass and was starting to drop down again when my headlights picked out a building at the side of the road. It was a small white chapel. I want to describe it the way I saw it, because I saw it clearly. It sat on a small flat patch of ground just off the right shoulder. A modest wooden building, maybe 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, painted white, with a steep roof and a small square steeple at the front. Wooden steps led up to a pair of double doors. The doors were the kind that arched at the top, and they were wide open, standing on their hinges as if someone had just walked in or out and had not bothered to close them. Through the open doorway, warm yellow light spilled out, the kind of buttery glow that comes from oil lamps, throwing a trapezoid of light across the steps and down onto the gravel. I could see the shape of a few wooden pews inside, and a small aisle running down the center, and what looked like a simple altar at the far end. I could not see any people. I slowed. The chapel looked like exactly the kind of place you might stop on a late-night drive, the kind of small country church that left its doors open for travelers. I had grown up in a Baptist church myself. There was something about it that was familiar and deeply reassuring. My foot came off the gas. My hand drifted toward the turn signal. Something stopped me. I cannot tell you, now, what it was. It was not a thought. I did not have a reasoned concern. What I had was a feeling, deep in my chest, that said, no. The kind of feeling you get when you are about to step off a curb and your body stops you and a second later a car comes around the corner. A hard, cold no that came up from somewhere older than thought. I did not turn. I let the car coast past the chapel, and I looked at it as I went by. Through the open doors, I could see the warm yellow light in the pews and the aisle, and a small bouquet of flowers on the altar. The gravel in front was undisturbed. There were no vehicles. The chapel looked, in every respect, like a working church on a summer night left open for whoever might come by. I kept driving. The feeling in my chest got worse once I was past it. I looked in my rearview mirror a few times. The light of the chapel stayed visible for longer than it should have, glowing warmly behind me, visible through the bends of the road in a way I could not quite account for. Then it was gone. I drove another 20 minutes. The country got even more remote. I was starting to think I had taken a wrong turn when the road came down out of another pass, and I saw the lights of a small town in the valley below. At the far end of the main street there was an all-night gas station, an independent place with 2 pumps and a lit sign that said Miller's 24 HRS. I pulled in. My legs were shaking a little. I had not realized how tightly I had been gripping the wheel. I went inside. The store was empty except for a woman at the counter, probably late 50s, heavy-set, with short gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She was doing a crossword on the back of a folded newspaper. "Evening," she said. "Getting late to be out on these roads." "Yes, ma'am. Coming back from a wedding in Pikeville." Took the back way. I poured a cup of coffee, got a packaged sandwich, brought them up. While she was ringing me up, I said, more to make conversation, "There's a nice little chapel back up the road a few miles." I thought about stopping. I don't think I've ever seen one with the doors open that late at night. The woman stopped ringing. Her hand was halfway to the scanner. She did not finish the motion. "A chapel," she said. "Describe it to me, please." Something in her voice made me answer carefully. I told her what I had seen. The white building, the steep roof, the steeple, the arched double doors standing open, the warm yellow light, the pews, the aisle, the altar, the bouquet of flowers, the gravel lot. No cars. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she finished ringing me up, slowly, and folded her hands on the counter. "Sir," she said, "there is no chapel on that road." I stared at her. There was one. A small Methodist chapel that served a little community that used to live up in that valley. Built in 1884. It burned down on a Sunday morning in August of 1934 during the 11 o'clock service. The fire started in a wood stove at the back of the sanctuary, spread very fast. The doors, for reasons nobody ever figured out, got jammed shut, maybe from the heat, maybe from a fallen beam. Everyone inside died. There were 31 people in the chapel that morning, including the pastor and his wife and 3 of their children. The congregation never rebuilt. The foundation is still out there, but there is no building standing. I did not say anything. "You're not the first," she said. "I have had this conversation 6 or 7 times. Always in summer, always late at night, always on that same stretch of road. People describe the chapel exactly the way you just did. Every detail the same. People tell me they almost stopped. Something made them keep driving." I asked her, in a voice I had trouble controlling, "What happens if somebody stops?" She looked at me steadily. "I have heard 2 stories in 30 years about people who stopped. Neither came from the people themselves, because those folks did not come out of that chapel. They came from passengers who stayed in the car." She told me about a young couple in 1987. The husband saw the chapel, pulled over, said he wanted to light a candle for his mother who had just passed. Walked up the steps, walked inside. The doors stayed open, the light stayed on. His wife sat in the car. After 20 minutes, she got out, walked up to the doors, called his name. Nobody answered. She said at the threshold, something in her froze. She could not make herself take another step. She backed down the steps and drove to the next town, came to this gas station. told the woman's father, who had been the clerk that night. The next morning, she went back with the county sheriff. There was no chapel. There was a foundation, grown over with weeds. Her husband was never found. She told me about a trucker in 2005. Saw the chapel, pulled over to pray about something, left his dog in the cab. A motorist came by 40 minutes later and found the truck on the shoulder, door open, dog whining. Across the road, a weed-grown foundation and nothing else. The trucker was never found. I asked her why she was telling me this. If she was sure, I'm telling you because you saw it, and because you did not stop. That's rare. The ones who stop don't come back. I have thought about this a long time. I don't know what the chapel is. I don't know what's inside it. I don't know if the people who died in 1934 are in there, waiting for the congregation to fill, or if it's something else. But I am telling you because you need to know, for the rest of your life, that you were about to walk into something, and something in you was strong enough to stop you. That is worth knowing. She was very calm. She was not performing. She was giving me, plainly, a piece of information she had given to travelers before, because her father had given it to travelers before her. I paid for my coffee and my sandwich. I asked if I could stay. She said as long as I wanted. I sat at a small plastic table by the coffee machine, and I drank my coffee slowly, and I did not really taste any of it. The woman went back to her crossword. She did not look at me again. I appreciated that. After about 20 minutes, I got in my car and drove the rest of the way home. I took the interstate. I got home a little after 5 in the morning, as the sky was starting to gray. I drank a glass of water, and I went to bed, and I slept hard until the afternoon. That was 19 years ago. I have not driven that back road since. I have thought about the chapel many times. I have thought about how warm the light was through the open doors, how peaceful it looked. The bouquet of flowers on the altar, and whether those flowers were the same flowers that had been on the altar on an August Sunday morning in 1934, and what it would have been like to walk up those wooden steps into that warm light and find myself at the back of a service that had been waiting 90 years for the congregation to fill. I think about how close I came. I think about whoever saw the chapel before me, in whatever year, and did stop, and is inside it now. If there is any times now, times inside of whatever that chapel is. I think about whoever has seen it since. And on the worst nights, I wonder whether there is still a woman working late at a gas station on a 2-lane road in eastern Kentucky, and whether, when she is eventually gone, anyone will be there to tell the next traveler who comes in pale and shaken what it was they almost walked into, and what it is they need to know for the rest of their life, that something in them was strong enough to refuse. My brother and I spent every summer at our grandfather's hunting cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina, from the time we were small boys until we were nearly grown men. The cabin had been built by our great-grandfather in 1927, a modest 2-bedroom structure of hand-cut logs, set on a shoulder of land about 12 miles outside the nearest small town, up a gravel road that climbed steeply through the hardwoods, and ended in a small clearing with a meadow in front and the deep woodlot rising up behind. Our grandfather had spent every summer of his own boyhood there, and after his father passed, he had inherited the cabin and had done the same thing with his own grandchildren that his father had done with him. Every June, as soon as school let out, he would drive my brother Mark and me up from our home in Charlotte, and he would keep us for 6 weeks. Our parents used the time for their own work and travel. We used it to fish, hike, shoot. 22 rifles at cans my grandfather set up on a fence post, and absorb, in the quiet, steady way boys absorb such things, the particular habits of an old man who had lived most of his life in one piece of country. Mark was 2 years older than me. We were close in the way brothers can be when they are isolated together for long stretches of time with only each other for company. We shared the small back bedroom of the cabin, with 2 narrow beds against opposite walls and a single window between them that looked out into the woodlot. We shared chores, we shared books, we shared my grandfather's attention, a steady, unsentimental kind of love expressed mostly through his willingness to teach us things. My grandfather had rules. Most of them were practical. Don't leave food out at night because of the raccoons. Don't walk the creek bed barefoot because of copperheads. Don't touch a gun unless he was standing next to you. Don't climb on the roof. Don't take the truck keys for any reason. We absorbed these rules and obeyed them without much thought. There was one rule that did not make sense. He told it to us, both together, on the first evening of our first summer alone with him, the summer I was 7 and Mark was 9. He sat us down at the kitchen table after supper and put both his hands flat on the wood, and he looked at us each in turn. Boys, I need to tell you one thing that I need you to remember, for as long as you are staying with me here. You listen to this more careful than anything else I tell you all summer. We sat up straighter. After dark, if you hear somebody call your name from the woods, you do not answer. You do not go to the window. You do not go to the door. You do not call back. You do not make a sound. It does not matter who it sounds like. It does not matter how many times they call. You do not answer. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Say it back. We said it back. He nodded slowly. Good. That's the one rule. You do not answer. The woods call you by name, you say nothing, you stay in bed. Promise me. We promise. He did not explain why. He did not tell us a story about what happened to people who answered. He simply gave us the rule, made us promise, and went on with the evening as if he had told us nothing more remarkable than not to feed the dog from the table. For 10 summers, across 11 years of visits, no one ever called our names from the woods. We heard owls. We heard a fox screaming once, which had both of us sitting up in our beds with our hearts pounding, because a fox's scream sounds so much like a woman's scream. We heard coyotes, but no voice, not a whisper. The rule sat there, unexercised, part of the architecture of our summers, but never called on. When I was 17, on a warm August night, the rule was called on. That summer was different. Mark was 19 and had spent most of it working at a camp in Georgia. My grandfather was 79, starting to slow down but still entirely himself, still getting up at 5, still splitting his own wood. It was just the two of us. I had the back bedroom to myself. The night it happened was in mid-August. The weather had been hot for a full week, and the nights had not cooled down. The cabin had no air conditioning. I had the window cracked open about 6 inches, and a small box fan on a chair at the foot of my bed was blowing warm air around. I had fallen asleep around 11, reading a paperback. My grandfather had gone to bed an hour before me. The cabin had been quiet for a long time. I woke up at about 2:30 in the morning. I woke up because someone was calling my name. I need to describe the voice carefully. It was a woman's voice. Not young, not old. Somewhere in the middle, the voice of a woman, maybe in her 40s, the age my mother had been at the time. The voice was warm. It was kind. It had the soft cadence of a woman calling a child in for supper or saying goodnight to a child she loved. It was a voice I did not recognize. The voice was outside the cabin, somewhere near the edge of the woods behind the house, maybe 30 or 40 feet from my window, close enough that the voice carried clearly through the open crack. The voice called my full name. It said my first name, and then my middle name, and then my last name, slowly, the way my mother had said them when I was small and had done something that required me to come into the kitchen and explain myself. Then it paused, and then it said my full name again. It was waiting for an answer. I lay very still. The fan was blowing warm air over my face. The voice was clear. I remembered the rule. I remembered my grandfather at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood, making me promise. The rule had sat in my mind for 10 years, patient and unused, like a key in a drawer for a lock I had never had to open. Now the lock was here. I did not answer. I did not move. I did not turn my head toward the window. The voice called my name again. The same patient cadence. It waited. I did not answer. It called a third time. Then, after a pause, it said, "Honey, I know you can hear me. Come to the window. I just want to see your face." The voice was almost pleading, but in the gentlest possible way. There was no threat. There was no anger. There was a deep tenderness, as if the woman on the other side of my window was someone who had loved me my whole life and only wanted to lay eyes on me. I did not answer. I did not look. The voice called my name a fourth time, a fifth, a sixth. The pauses between were getting shorter. The voice was still gentle, still patient, but it was calling more often now. I want to try to describe what I felt. The fear of that night was not the fear I had expected when I was 7 and my grandfather had told me the rule. The voice was kind. The voice made me want, very much, to go to the window. There was something in me, some part I had not known about, that wanted to see who was calling, wanted to answer, wanted to stand in the moonlight and say, "Yes, I am here." I did not. I lay on my back and looked at the ceiling and did not move. The calling went on for almost 20 minutes. I know because I glanced at my watch during one of the pauses, and again when the voice finally stopped. 2:31 when I first looked, 2:50 when it stopped. The voice did not taper. It did not grow frustrated. It simply stopped. It called my name once, in the same gentle voice, and then it did not call again. The crickets, which I realized only then had gone silent during the calling, slowly started up again. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, my grandfather was already in the kitchen. He saw my face. He poured me a cup of coffee, which I had been allowed for the past year, and sat down across from me and waited. I told him everything: the woman's voice, the full name, the warmth, the pleas, the 20 minutes, how I had not moved. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he sipped his coffee. Then he nodded slowly. "You did right." He told me he had been afraid of this conversation for a long time. He told me he was going to tell me what his father had told him. He was going to tell me the rest of the rule. His older brother, my great-uncle, had answered such a call one summer night in 1952, when he was 22, and was visiting the cabin alone. He had been sleeping in the back bedroom I had just slept in. He had heard a voice calling his name, a woman's voice, kind and warm. He had not known about the rule, because their father had only told my grandfather, who had been 15 that summer. Their father had been planning to tell the older sons but had not gotten around to it. My great-uncle had answered. He had gone to the window. My grandfather, in his own bed on the other side of the cabin, had heard him walk to the window, heard him say, "Yes? Who's there?" Then my grandfather had heard him walk to the front door, unlock it, and go outside. My grandfather, 15 years old, had been too frightened to leave his own bed. He had told his father in the morning. They had searched the woods for 3 days. They had never found my great-uncle. They had found his pajamas, half a mile into the woodlot, folded neatly on a flat stone beside the creek, as if he had taken them off himself and set them down carefully and walked on. They had never found any trace of him beyond that. "It is older than our family," he said. My father told me his own grandfather had known about it. Some of the old people in these mountains used to have more rules for it. They would leave out a bowl of milk by the door, or a piece of bread on the porch. I don't know if any of that helped. I only know the rule my father gave me. You do not answer. You do not look. No matter how kind the voice is, no matter how much you want to, you lie still and you do not make a sound, and eventually the voice goes away. And in the morning, you have a long life ahead of you. He looked at me steadily. "Son, I want you to promise me something more. I want you to promise that when you have your own children, you will tell them the rule. You will tell them early. Younger is better. Young children accept the rule. Older children question it." My brother was grown, and nobody had told him, and he answered, and he is gone. "Promise me you will tell your own." I promised him. He died 4 years later, in 1997. The cabin passed to my father, who eventually sold it to a couple from Asheville. I have not been back. I am 38 now. I have 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 4. I told my son about the rule last summer. I sat him down at the kitchen table the way my grandfather had sat me down, and I put my hands flat on the wood, and I gave him the rule in the same words. I did not tell him why. I made him promise. He promised. In the serious way small children promise things when they can tell the adult is serious. I will tell my daughter when she is a little older. I do not know if the voice will ever come for them. I do not know if it was just that one cabin, or that one stretch of woodlot, or if it is something that moves. But my grandfather was clear that the rule was older than our family, and that it had kept us alive, and that was enough reason. I sometimes think about the voice, in the quiet hours, about how gentle it was, about how much it wanted me to come to the window. I think about my great-uncle, walking out into a woodlot in his pajamas in 1952, answering a voice he did not know, and how he must have felt in the last moments before whatever happened to him happened. I hope, for his sake, that the voice was as kind to him all the way to the end as it was to me in those 20 minutes. I hope, for all of us who did not answer, that we never have to find out what it turns into when you do.